Introduction to the Art of Badminton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Art of Badminton by Sir George Thomas, Baronet. Introduction. Badminton is a game which, at the outset, presents no special obstacles to the beginner, but this lack of difficulty in the initial stages is apt to prove a trap to the unwary, and to hamper steady progress later on, since it so often gives rise to careless and unsound methods, easily acquired but extremely hard to eradicate. The beginner, believing himself to be getting on swimmingly, frequently pays much less attention to the details of stroke production and so forth than he would if they gave him more trouble at the start, with the result that, after advancing fairly rapidly up to a certain stage, he finds further improvement extraordinarily difficult, owing to some radical defect in his methods. He can execute most strokes after a fashion, but real mastery over them is quite out of his reach, and will remain so until he overcomes the failing that holds him back. Good badminton can in fact only be built up on a thoroughly sound foundation, and anyone who aims at proficiency must be very careful from the first to develop his game along the right lines. With this object, he should examine for himself the principles involved, making sure that he understands their raison d'être as well as their application. In this book, I have tried to arrange the sequence of ideas in such a way as to avoid, as far as possible, the necessity for constant reiteration of fundamental points, though I have found a certain amount of repetition unavoidable. For this reason, I want to impress on the beginner the importance of keeping in mind principles already laid down when going on to anything fresh. For example, the chapters dealing with particular strokes are not complete in themselves. To make them so would entail the tedious reiteration in each of much contained in the previous chapters on footwork, etc. But there is no need for that if the beginner, appreciating the fact that the correct execution of a stroke often depends as much on the position of his feet as on the manipulation of his racket, applies the essential principles already enunciated as he goes along. By this, I do not mean that all players should strive to produce the same stroke in exactly the same way. There are certain definite rules which no one can contravene with impunity, and it is these that the beginner must keep well in his mind. But there is also plenty of scope for individuality in style, and I am altogether opposed to slavish imitation of any particular player, however skillful. Many minor details of method arise from the personal characteristics of the individual concerned, and, subject always to proper observance of the real essentials, everyone should aim at developing along the lines natural to himself. Though without falling into the error of copying a model too closely, much can of course be learned by observing the methods of experts, both in regard to strokes and to tactics. As with anything else worth doing well, the more you know about the game, the more pleasure you are likely to derive from it, from the actual performance that is, quite apart from any superior attraction in winning as opposed to losing. At its best, badminton is a remarkable combination of strenuous exercise, manual dexterity, and subtle headwork. There is, I think, no other game in which these contrasting features are so harmoniously blended. The casual spectator is probably more impressed by the quick working of hand and eye, and the almost uncanny accuracy of the placing, than by anything else. But the finer points of the play, though less obvious, are even more fascinating to anyone who really understands them, while from the purely athletic point of view there can be no finer exercise. Judged from any angle, it is a game of the very highest class, and, rapidly as it has gained ground in recent years, I feel sure that the near future will see it making still greater progress in popular favor. I wish here to express my gratitude to Mr. P.V. Dupré, to whom I am indebted for all the photographs which illustrate this book, also to Mr. G.S.B. Mack and Mr. J.F. Devlin, the present holders of the doubles championship, who very kindly posed for a number of the photographs. End of introduction. Chapter 1 of The Art of Badminton by Sir George Thomas Baronet. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1. The Racket and How to Hold It. A really good racket is, of course, a necessity to anyone who wishes to play well. Equally, of course, it would be easy to overestimate its effect on the play of its owner. For, in badminton, as in other avocations, a bad workman is apt to blame his tools. A capable player can, as a matter of fact, make excellent strokes with almost anything in the shape of a racket, but only with one that really suits him can he do himself justice. The choice of a racket is, therefore, a matter to be undertaken with care. The qualities to be desired include both lightness and power, which are in a sense mutually antagonistic, any extreme development of the one leading to a corresponding sacrifice of the other, and the individual must discover the compromise best suited to himself between these conflicting requirements. Here it is only possible to indicate the chief points which should influence his choice. These are balance, weight, the shape and size of the handle, stringing, and good workmanship. The balance of a racket goes a long way towards making or marring it. Roughly speaking, a well-balanced racket may be defined as one feeling lighter than it really is. Of two rackets, that which is actually the heavier may, if better balanced, seem appreciably the lighter in the hand. It will then be easier to manipulate, while possessing an extra quarter of an ounce or so of weight for service in those strokes which require power. And though a quarter of an ounce may sound very little, it makes a lot of difference in so light an implement. While the greater ease of manipulation is of vital importance, many strokes requiring the quickest possible movement of the head of the racket. This combination of essential qualities is obtained by reducing the weight of the head in comparison to that of the handle. The amount of wood in the head is cut down virtually to a minimum, subject to the preservation of sufficient strength to stand the strain of tight stringing. The thickness of the shaft joining the head to the handle is also reduced, again subject to necessary considerations of strength. Properly proportioned in this respect, the racket should feel hardly any weight at all, and when swung, the head should come up so easily as to move apparently of its own volition. Even in this, however, I think one may have too much of a good thing, and I, personally, like a shade more weight in the head than the majority of good players. Not a heavy head, of course, but one the weight of which has not been reduced to the absolute minimum. I find there is then sufficient ease of manipulation for all practical purposes, while the extra weight is very useful for hard hitting. The rackets I use weigh about 5 7/8 ounces, varying possibly 1/8 of an ounce either way, and balance about 10½ inches from the end of the handle. That is to say, the racket should balance evenly if supported at that point. But to show how tastes differ, I may mention that XIII, though an unusually hard hitter overhead, likes an exceptionally light racket, as near 5 ounces as he can get it, I believe. Most good players, I fancy, use rackets weighing between 5 1/4 and 5 3/4 ounces. The exact shape and size of the handle is also a matter for individual taste, and you should choose one that fits comfortably into your hand, giving you a secure grip. I use a handle 4 1/2 inches in circumference, and with the facets parallel to the playing face of the racket only a trifle broader than those at the sides. The difference is just enough for me to feel it, but no more. Many players, however, like it to be much more pronounced, giving the handle a comparatively flat shape. This flat handle possibly gives a more secure grip to anyone who suffers from a tendency to let his racket twist in his hand. But the usual source of trouble in such a case lies, I fancy, in having too small a handle rather than in one of the wrong shape. The power of a racket depends almost as much on its stringing as on its weight, and I like one strung absolutely as tightly as possible. But good stringing is not only a question of tension. The quality of the gut is also a vital factor. It should be fine and, when held up to the light, look clear and of uniform density, without dull spots in it. This is, of course, one of the essentials of good workmanship. Some of the others, a properly seasoned frame and so forth, are not so readily apparent and must be taken more or less on trust. That, however, can be done pretty safely in the case of any well-established brand, for racket making has been brought to a very high pitch of excellence by the leading manufacturers. Now, as regards the grip, that is, the method of holding the racket, Even in such a fundamental matter as this, there is no strict uniformity of practice among the experts. However, although small differences do exist, I think my own grip is fairly typical of that of the great majority of strong players, and I shall refer to it from now on as the normal grip. The two illustrations of it, plates 1 and 2, show the front and the back view of the hand, and a study of those illustrations will convey more clearly than a long written description the exact position of the fingers, etc. The main points for the beginner to observe are that the handle is grasped practically at the end, that the facet of the handle crossing the palm of the hand is one of the two parallel with the face of the racket, and that the knuckles at the base of the fingers lie diagonally across the facet. It will be noticed that the second joint of my thumb bends down the handle, overlapping the first finger, but that is one of the minor details in regard to which good players differ, many keeping this joint practically straight across the side of the handle, and the position which comes most naturally and comfortably to anyone is, I think, the best as far as he is concerned. The way in which fingers and thumb circle the handle must naturally depend somewhat on the size of both hand and handle, but as long as the knuckles lie correctly across the facet, there can be nothing much wrong. This normal grip seems to me absolutely natural for most purposes, and I use it for nearly all strokes, either forehand or backhand. As almost all badminton players also play lawn tennis, it may be as well to point out there is not, at badminton, the same reason for giving the handle a quarter turn before a backhand stroke as there is at lawn tennis. In the first place, you have not to keep the trajectory of the shuttlecock as low as that of the ball in the case of a backhand drive, and secondly, there is no question of imparting topspin. Some good players do, I fancy, turn the handle a little, though not so much as at lawn tennis, for certain backhand strokes, but in my opinion this is not only unnecessary, but actually detrimental. The thing to aim at, in the grip for any particular stroke, is to be able to bring the playing face of the racket squarely against the shuttlecock, that is to say, to make a perfectly planed hit without anything in the way of cut or chop or slice. Now, if you hold the racket with a normal grip and swing it about on your backhand, you will find that you can, with a perfectly natural movement, bring its face squarely against the shuttlecock at any point you please on that side of you. That being so, it is quite unnecessary to shift your grip round the handle. A notable point in regard to which experts differ is the position of the thumb in backhand strokes. Quite a number point the thumb up the handle for certain of these strokes, the theory being, I think, that this helps to control direction. This position is illustrated in plate 3. J.F. Devlin, the subject of that photograph, only uses this position of the thumb for high strokes, such as a lob taken well above the level of the shoulder, but a few first-class players use it also for strokes taken much lower down. G.S.B. Mack is another great player who places the thumb thus for backhand strokes. See the finish of his backhand smash in plate 8. So anyone who adopts that method will be in irreproachable company. Personally, however, I am in the opposite camp and keep my thumb across the handle for all strokes. I have tried the other plan, but it did not seem in my case to be of any benefit, and this is, I consider, one of those details in which the individual should follow his natural inclination. Though keeping almost entirely to the normal grip, I do modify it slightly for a certain type of backhand stroke, in which the wrist is kept rather low, and the head of the racket comes forward almost directly above it. For such a stroke, I sometimes unbend the fingers very slightly, letting the handle go with them, so that the lower part of the ball of the thumb, instead of being close up to the handle as in plate 1, is separated from it by a small gap. Seen from the back, the base knuckle of the first finger would be in the same position as in plate 2, but the line of the other knuckles would not slope so far across the handle. This slight modification seems to give a little extra freedom to the wrist, but it weakens the tension of the grip and is only of service, even in connection with the strokes specified, when snap rather than force is required, so it should be used comparatively seldom. A much more important change is that illustrated by J.F. Devlin in plate 4. As I have already indicated, you'll want to hold your racket in such a way that you can bring its face squarely against the shuttlecock without putting your wrist into an awkward position. And you will easily find by experiment that the only case where the normal grip is in the least at fault in this respect is when you have to take the shuttlecock somewhere in front of your face. Now, from the normal grip, give the racket half a turn in your hand. You will then find that it comes naturally into position for hitting in front of your face. This is the grip illustrated in Plate 4, and it is particularly useful for rushing a short service or any similar stroke. A few of the best women players use this as their standard grip, but these almost all specialize as net players in the back and front formation. It is certainly excellently adapted to the sort of work they perform at the net, but further back in the court, it is, just as certainly, inferior to the normal grip, and I think even the habitual net player should only use it when near the net, changing to the normal whenever forced back. With a little practice, there is no great difficulty in becoming sufficiently at home with both grips to be able to use whichever is most suitable to the moment. In general, the grip should be relaxed between strokes and tightened just as the shuttlecock is struck, but never tightened so much as to impair the flexibility of the wrist. Many a player makes this mistake when trying to hit especially hard. He holds his racket so tightly that he stiffens his wrist, with the result that the extra sting, which only the wrist can impart, is lost. But without going to that extreme, the grip should always be firm, even for the most delicate of drop shots. The racket is so light that in many strokes the actual force exerted by the hand is very small indeed. For example, if you are barely in time to reach a drop shot, you will find that you can give yourself an extra couple of inches or so of reach by shooting the handle right upward so that it is gripped only by the thumb and 2 fingers, and still have sufficient power to return the shuttlecock from near the floor, though that is naturally a resource to be used only in extremity. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of The Art of Badminton by Sir George Thomas, Baronet. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2 Footwork and Poise. Footwork is the real foundation of good badminton, and almost everything you do in the course of a game depends on it to some extent. In addition to its obvious influence on your mobility, it affects not only the ease and, where necessary, the power of your stroke, but even your choice of stroke, and therefore your tactics. For, with your feet correctly placed, you will usually have at your command a wider range of strokes than would otherwise be the case. As with other phases of the game, correct footwork is largely a matter of instinct. Its elements come naturally to almost anyone with an aptitude for playing games of an active type. Nevertheless, the special characteristics of badminton and similar games necessitate refinements of footwork which do not arise in other forms of athletics, and even the most talented natural athlete will do well to consider these. While the player not blessed with instinctive ability will find that a careful observance of general principles will enable him to use his feet to much better purpose and thereby improve his whole game. 2 distinct ideas underlie the principles of footwork. 1. Mobility. 2. Position for the execution of a stroke. For purposes of analysis, these may be treated separately, though in practice they react on each other, lack of mobility often forcing the striker to play a stroke when wrongly positioned, while conversely, a stroke played with the feet awkwardly placed robs the striker, for a fraction of a second, which may be all-important, of the ability to move promptly in any direction. Taking mobility first, good footwork expresses itself in the ability to start or change direction quickly rather than in actual pace when on the move. Once moving, a player's mobility depends on his speed, but the distance to be traversed on a badminton court is never very great, and there is seldom time to make up for a slow start by actual fleetness of foot. Though sheer speed is, of course, very valuable, and the ideal player would combine great pace with phenomenal quickness. But development of speed is a matter of physical training, an arduous course for which many have neither time nor inclination, and, in any case, unconnected with the technique of the game. The mobility which depends on footwork is very different and can be developed in the ordinary course of practice. The first essential is to be constantly on the toes when waiting for your opponent's shot, not exaggeratedly so, just sufficiently to balance the weight of the body on that portion of the feet that gives the impetus when movement is desired. It is not necessary to raise the heels high off the floor. You gain nothing by doing so, and only put an undue strain on the muscles, resulting in weariness and loss of mobility towards the end of a hard match. What counts is to carry your weight properly. So long as none of it rests on either heel, you are on your toes for practical purposes, even though one or both of your heels may be almost even actually in contact with the floor. When one foot is in advance of the other, the heel of the backward foot should usually be slightly raised. But, though on your toes, you will not be properly poised if you allow your weight to remain stationary on either foot, or even equally divided between the two. You must keep shifting it from one foot to the other. Only by so doing will you retain the option of starting with equal readiness in any direction, since more effort is always required to move a dead weight than one that is oscillating. As a natural corollary to carrying your weight on the ball of the feet, your knees will be slightly, though almost imperceptibly, bent, and your body inclined a little forward from the waist. Otherwise, your balance would be insecure. In certain positions, where one foot is well in advance of the other, as when in readiness to rush a short service, the forward inclination of the body is accentuated, as is also the bending of the knee of the advanced leg, while the heel of the backward foot comes well away from the floor. While waiting for your opponent to hit, you should have your feet an easy distance apart, so that your position is natural and unconstrained. If they are too close together or too widely separated, you will not control your balance so well. It is impossible to specify exactly how far apart the feet should be, but I fancy about 1/3 of the length of a running stride would generally meet the case. That is to say, if a player strides about 4 feet when running at full stretch, his normal waiting position should be with his feet about 16 inches apart. Your readiness to move must be at its highest pitch at the precise moment when your opponent strikes the shuttlecock. Until he actually does so, you cannot be sure what he is going to do. You may guess at his intentions. You may frequently guess right. But, unless he be singularly devoid of guile, you will also frequently guess wrong, however intelligent your anticipation. And when you do guess wrong, you will be apt, if you have allowed your guess to influence your balance, to find yourself in the helpless condition known as being on the wrong foot, when you cannot reach a perfectly simple shot for the sole reason that you had made up your mind to move in the opposite direction and had prematurely conveyed that intention to your feet. I do not want this to be read as condemning the exercise of anticipation. Properly used, anticipation is a very valuable asset, but, except in rare cases, it should not be pushed so far as to be in the nature of a gamble. Anyhow, it is a subject on which I shall have something to say at a later stage, when we come to tactics. Normally, then, you should reserve complete freedom of action until your opponent has actually struck the shuttlecock, though you want to be on the move as soon afterwards as possible. Naturally, quickness of sight and perception, the ability to judge the flight of the shuttlecock directly it has left the racket, come in here. But once you have made up your mind as to where you have to go, and the process should be virtually instantaneous, the celerity with which you start depends on your poise and on the way your feet are supporting your weight. Correctly poised and balanced, you will get to the move just that fraction of a second more quickly that may make all the difference to the result of the rally. So far, I have written as though you were in position in the most favorable part of the court, waiting for your opponent's stroke. In the ordinary course of a rally, however, you will be more or less on the move all the time, and after playing a stroke, you will frequently find yourself some distance from the precise spot where you can best await your opponent's return. If you can reach this desirable spot before your opponent hits the shuttlecock, well and good, but there will be many cases, especially in a single, when you cannot do so. In such a case, you must not let your anxiety to get there betray you into sacrificing your ability to move in any direction. Get as near as you can to the desired spot before your opponent plays, but if you are still moving fast when he actually hits, it will be easy for him to send the shuttlecock towards that part of the court from which you are coming, and almost impossible for you to turn and get back in time. Therefore, at the latest possible moment before he plays his stroke, check your momentum and bring your feet into position so as to be able to make an instantaneous turn if necessary. By gauging this latest possible moment exactly right, you will extricate yourself from many difficulties, whereas if you check your movement too soon, thus remaining unnecessarily far from your proper position in court, or too late, thereby risking being caught on the wrong foot, you may give your opponent an easy opening. Occasions will arise when you have been maneuvered so far out of position that nothing but luck or an indifferent stroke by your opponent, which after all is pure luck as far as you are concerned, can save you. At such a time, your best chance may be to gamble on the most likely return and make for some particular point, abandoning all other considerations. But, except in these extreme cases, it will pay you better to be a little further away, with your balance and power of turning perfectly under control, than a little nearer with your control faulty. This is such an important point, and seems so little appreciated by many beginners, that I want to rub it in thoroughly. The guiding principle, on which quickness as differentiated from speed depends, is to be in a state of supreme readiness to move in any direction at the exact moment when the shuttlecock leaves your opponent's racket. All good players act on this principle, though probably none of them consciously think about it. Partly by instinct, partly by experience, it has become second nature, though even the most expert will now and again be lured on to the wrong foot by a sufficiently clever feint. But the average weak player is constantly caught in this way because, deceived as to his opponent's intention, he commits himself just too soon to movement in some particular direction. Another important aid to mobility is to avoid, whenever possible, hitting the shuttlecock while actually moving away from your base. By which I mean the particular part of the court where you would like to be when waiting for the return. If you do hit while moving away from it, a fraction of a second will elapse after you have made your stroke before you can turn and start to get back. If, on the other hand, you pull up before you hit, you will save that fraction of a second, which may make all the difference in enabling you to get back to your base. There will, of course, be many occasions when you can only just get to the shuttlecock and must play the stroke on the run. And there will be others when it is important to hit the shuttlecock as soon as possible, before your opponent can recover from a bad position. But in a general way, when you have any time to spare, do not waste it by moving slowly into position. Get there quickly, so as to prepare for returning towards your base directly you have played your stroke. Turn now to the other class of footwork, that which plays its part in the actual execution of the various strokes. Here there are two factors to be considered: the relative position of the feet with regard to each other, and their combined position in regard to the shuttlecock. Consider first the relative position of the feet. On this depends the proper use of the weight of the body in strokes requiring power, and also, in backhand strokes, the free swing of the racket. For this reason, all backhand strokes should be played with the right foot in advance of the left and frequently across it. If you stand with your feet an equal distance from the net, or with your left foot advanced, you cannot swing your racket freely on your backhand because your body is in the way. This assumes, of course, that you are right-handed. For a left-handed player, the details must naturally be reversed. By advancing your right foot, you bring your right shoulder forward and thereby allow your arm a clear field for action on your left flank. For the normal backhand stroke, the right foot should be roughly directly in front of the left. That is, the line joining the feet should be at right angles to the net. This will bring your shoulders at the commencement of the stroke parallel to the sideline. But this applies only to cases in which the shuttlecock, when you hit it, is nearer the net than you are. The further back it is in relation to yourself, the more you must bring your right foot across, and the more you must turn your body away from the net. In extreme cases, such as when you chase the shuttlecock into the baseline corner and arrive only just in time to take it near the front, your back will be turned to the net and your right foot nearer the baseline than your left. That, however, will be from necessity, not from choice. Whenever you can, take the shuttlecock when it is nearer the net than you are, with your right foot more or less directly in front of the left. Some experts hold that in this position both feet should point towards the sideline, at the commencement of the stroke anyway. I do not think that is correct. In my opinion, the left foot only should point in that direction, the right being turned more forward, though not directly towards the net. This is, I consider, more natural and comfortable, and leaves the striker more favorably placed at the completion of his stroke for whatever may happen next. Of course, the further you bring your right foot across, the more the toe will turn towards the sideline, in extreme cases towards the baseline. Also, the nearer the ground you take the shuttlecock, the further should the toe turn from the net. But in the case of strokes taken above the level of the shoulder, and not too far back, the right toe may point almost straight to the net. During the entire swing of the stroke, including the follow-through, the right foot will preserve its initial position, and that is why I prefer to have it pointing as straight towards the net as may be consistent with the forward position of the right shoulder and the free swing of the arm. The left foot, however, should usually make a partial turn as the weight of the body is brought forward. The extent of this turn depends partly on the distance between the feet and partly on the direction of the stroke. It should be most pronounced in the case of shots played across the body and with the feet wide apart. The turn will be on the ball of the foot, the heel being raised and swung back, and the further apart the feet are, the more pronounced should be this lifting of the heel. But the right foot should be flat on the ground throughout the stroke. The vital principle of having the right foot advanced applies to all backhand strokes, including the rarely used backhand smash. For the ordinary smash and for all other strokes taken high on the forehand, the position of the feet is equally important but reversed. For these strokes, the left foot should be in advance but not much, the heel seldom being more than 6 inches in front of, and sometimes no more than level with, the toe of the other foot. It may be as well to repeat here that details of this kind must only be taken as a rough guide. They vary with different players and according to the circumstances of the moment. The important thing is to have the left foot sufficiently in advance to enable the weight of the body to be brought forward onto it at the right moment. Otherwise, power of stroke will be sacrificed, and though some overhead strokes do not require power, they should all be played in the same way so as to preserve the option of hitting either hard or gently till the latest possible moment. Also, if you only trouble about the position of your feet when you mean to hit hard, you will convey useful information to an alert opponent, while the more particular you are to be correctly positioned for every stroke, the sooner will correct footwork become a matter of instinct, as it must be before you can do any real good at the game. For more overhead strokes, forehand, both feet point towards the net, with the advanced foot not directly in front of the other, but a few inches to the left. Contrary to the action in the case of backhand strokes, the advanced foot seldom remains flat on the ground throughout. As the body is bent back at the commencement of the stroke, the left heel is usually raised. With the forward swing, the heel returns to the ground, on which the foot is flat at the finish of the stroke. The action of the right foot is exactly the reverse, starting flat and finishing with the heel raised, or even, when the impetus is sufficient, with the whole foot off the floor. In the case of forehand strokes, other than those played overhead, the position of the feet is not bound by such definite rules. There is no necessity to get the body out of the way of the arm, which has an open field with either foot advanced. Therefore, the special circumstances of the moment, rather than any hard and fast rule, should guide you. With the right foot forward, you have an appreciably longer reach, and this position is useful for picking up a drop shot or, in general, for any occasion when the shuttlecock can only be reached with an effort. But with the left foot advanced, you command greater force and a little more freedom in the backward swing of your racket, and this may be taken as the normal, though not by any means the invariable, position for this class of stroke. With the advance of the left foot, the left shoulder will naturally come a little forward, but you should not turn so far towards the sideline as in the corresponding position for a backhand stroke. There is no need to do that, as the racket is already on the side where it is wanted, while by turning unnecessarily, you will bring your body into a position where it slightly cramps the action of a cross-court stroke. Therefore, though not directly facing the net, the angle at which you turn from it should not be very pronounced. The same consideration affects the angle of your feet. The left foot should not be directly in front of the other, but appreciably to the left. This is a very important point in which the normal stance for forehand strokes differs from that for the backhand, and a forehand stroke should never, except unavoidably, be played with the left foot across, that is, nearer to the right-hand line than the right, and the back inclined towards the net. There is still to be considered the combined position of the feet in relation to the shuttlecock. Here, the main consideration is to be far enough away to use the full sweep of the arm. If too near, you will cramp your swing and lose both power and control. It is true that certain drop shots, especially if taken near the top of the net, may be played as well with a slightly bent as with a straight arm. In almost all strokes, however, you will get the best results by making full use of your reach, and you should adjust your distance accordingly. Whenever possible, moreover, placing yourself so that you can play forward at the shuttlecock. Given plenty of time, it is an easy matter to place the feet correctly for any particular stroke. The difficulty arises when the striker is pressed for time, and it is then that really good footwork is revealed in its highest form. The player who possesses this attribute always seems to arrange matters so that his last stride, before he hits the shuttlecock, brings his feet naturally into the most favorable position. This is, I believe, instinct, pure and simple, and though it can be cultivated to some extent, it cannot be taught, certainly not in words. As a rough hint, however, it may be asserted that the instinctive adjustment of the feet is made at the beginning of the run, not at the end, generally by means of one or two very short steps. Another important point in moving the feet is to avoid lifting them high and banging them down. Aim at a gliding motion. If your footwork is really good, you will move about almost silently. The player who makes a frequent stamping noise is pretty sure to be handicapping himself by faulty methods. It has already been pointed out that one of the chief functions of footwork is to ensure the correct balance of the body and the utilization of its weight for strokes requiring power. This is accomplished by bringing the weight forward at the exact moment when the shuttlecock is struck. At the commencement of the stroke, the weight should be carried by the backward foot. Then, at the moment of impact, it is transferred, more or less violently, according to the force required, onto the advanced foot. This shifting forward of the weight actually occurs in almost all strokes, even those requiring a light and delicate touch, but where force is not required, the movement is performed so smoothly and gently that no extra momentum is imparted to the stroke. Where force is required, however, the weight is thrown forward vigorously, and the impetus thus conveyed will, if accurately timed, have great effect. This is especially important in smashing or in clearing a shot low on the backhand from near the base line, but it plays its part whenever hard hitting is called for. With the feet incorrectly placed, it would be impossible to use the weight in this way, as any attempt to do so would throw the striker off his balance. In many strokes, useful help in preserving the balance is rendered by the left arm. This is a point overlooked by many beginners, though it comes naturally to most of those with real aptitude for the game. This arm should be used to counterbalance the movement of the other, not as though holding a second racket, of course, but sufficiently freely to act as a sort of counterpoise. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of The Art of Badminton by Sir George Thomas Baronet. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3 Stroke Production. A perfect stroke is produced by several factors acting in unison. It does not depend only on correct manipulation of the racket, which may be taken to include the whole action of the arm and wrist. Equally essential are correct use of the feet, perfect balance, and proper utilization of weight. Even given perfection of these details, the stroke, though faultlessly produced, may be very far indeed from a perfect stroke. For, however admirable in itself, it cannot be good if played at the wrong time. So that the perfect stroke combines not only perfect execution, in which arm, feet, body, and eye all play their part, but also judicious head work. In this chapter, however, I shall confine myself to the action of the arm, wrist, and racket, assuming that the striker is correctly poised and positioned, and neglecting tactical considerations. I have already dealt with the main principles of footwork and balance, and shall not concern myself with them here except where their application needs emphasizing for any special reason. But their close connection with all strokes must be kept in mind all the time. Also, for the present, I shall confine myself to general points which apply, more or less, to every type of shot, leaving the special features of individual strokes to be dealt with separately later on. Every stroke may be divided roughly into 3 parts. 1. The preliminary action, which may be anything from a full swing to a mere placing of the racket in position. 2. The definite act of striking. And 3. The follow-through. As far as the preliminary action is concerned, you have 2 main objects to achieve. The first, to time matters so that your racket meets the shuttlecock at that particular point of its course where you can control its flight most effectively. The second, to avoid giving information to your opponent. Both these objects are best served in the great majority of strokes by using the full stretch of the arm. If you hit with a bent elbow, you generally lose some degree of control as regards both power and direction. This not only militates against accuracy, but also limits your option and makes it easier for your opponent to anticipate your stroke. You should therefore time matters whenever possible so that your arm may be practically straight at the moment of impact. This does not imply that it should be straight throughout the swing. Stiffness of action is always to be avoided. At the commencement of the swing, the elbow should usually be well bent, particularly for overhead work or for backhand strokes taken at all late. The straightening process should take place gradually and culminate at the precise moment of impact. Properly timed, this allows a little extra snap to be imparted to certain strokes that require it, though the wrist is mainly responsible for anything of that nature. On occasion, you cannot help hitting with the bent arm, as for instance when you have to defend at close range against a shot directed at your body, and have time neither to step back nor to intercept the shuttlecock until it is almost on you. Even in such a case, you should take the shuttlecock as far from your body as possible, and, though having no time to move your feet, you will often find that you can ease the difficulty by swaying your body to one side out of the shuttlecock's path, thus giving your arm a little more room in which to work. There are also a few drop shots taken near the top of the net which may without disadvantage be played with a bent arm, but these are exceptions to the general rule, and even these can be played equally well with a straight arm. In extent, the preliminary swing varies enormously. In rushing a short service, for example, there is really none at all, the arm and racket being simply pushed forward in front of the face. Many strokes, however, require a fairly pronounced swing, and this must, of course, always commence with a backward movement. Unduly hurrying, this backward movement is a very common mistake, and results in a jerky motion, perhaps even a pause before the racket comes forward again, which is altogether wrong. The backward and forward portions of the swing should be merged in one smooth, continuous movement, and, with this end in view, it is better that they should not traverse the same path. In practically all cases where the swing back is pronounced, the head of the racket should be held well above the level of the hand. Before an overhead stroke, the hand should be carried back rather low, somewhat below the level of the waist. the racket being held almost perpendicularly. There is then an upward sweep joining the backward and forward swings. For other strokes, the hand should be higher as it is carried back, the connecting swing then coming in a downwards direction. This is more marked on the backhand than on the forehand, the hand going back on a level with the shoulder for many backhand strokes. And it may be noted in passing that most details of stroke technique, whether connected with foot, body, or arm, are accentuated in the case of the backhand. As the racket comes forward, you can increase the pace of the swing as much as seems desirable, sufficiently to enable you to follow through with full force if you wish, but not to such an extent as to rob you of absolute control in case you desire to play a delicate shot. This is where you must remember the supreme importance of not revealing your intentions till the latest possible moment. Whether you mean to hit hard or softly, straight down or across the court, at a high or a low trajectory, your preliminary action should be the same. Therefore, the pace and direction of your forward swing must be such as to leave all these options open to you. I do not mean that you should always swing your racket at uniform speed. That may vary for any of several reasons, such as the time at your disposal. But the essential point, to which a beginner cannot pay too much attention, is to be able, in any situation, to make widely different strokes without any obvious difference in the preliminary movement. Later, as your control becomes more perfect, you can practice the refinement of making the same stroke in different ways. That is the real basis of feinting. To offer misleading information may, if you can induce your opponent to believe you, experienced players are painfully suspicious of these little traps, be even better than to convey none. The art of feinting should, however, be one of the later additions to your equipment. You will find that you can develop it without much difficulty, once your mastery over the shuttlecock has reached a sufficiently high pitch. But until you have attained that pitch, attempts at feinting will cost you much more than they are worth. Much more important, in the early stages of your development, is acquisition of the art of giving no information at all. Whatever the actual momentum of your arm, the pace at which the shuttlecock leaves your racket can be regulated, to a considerable extent, by the action of your wrist operating at the moment of impact. When the wrist alone can regulate the pace sufficiently, it is the best instrument for the purpose, as it is the last to come into play. But you will frequently need a wider variation of pace than can be furnished by wrist action alone, and you must then speed up or slow down your preliminary swing. Such a change should not be made too abruptly. Jerkiness is always a fault. When you have to reduce the pace of your swing, you should actually complete the process before, but only just before, you strike the shuttlecock. On the other hand, an increase of pace should be maintained progressively throughout the remainder of the stroke, so that it culminates in the follow-through. But even here, the change should start before the moment of impact. If you postpone it until your racket is actually in contact with the shuttlecock, your control will not be so good, and in extreme cases, you may even make a foul stroke. Subject to these qualifications, any change in the pace of your swing should come as late as possible, so that your intention may not be revealed sooner than necessary. Here again, I am referring to normal strokes, not to feints. When trying to fox an opponent, you can introduce all sorts of variations into your swing, but you should master the plain method first, reserving the embellishments for later on. The preliminary swing is almost entirely governed by the arm. At the start, the wrist may be used to bring the head of the racket into position, but from then till just before the actual impact, the work is done by the arm. When possible, the movement of the arm should be so controlled as to allow the stroke to be played with the head of the racket above the level of the wrist. This is not always possible, but is advantageous when it can be managed, especially the familiar slogan, "on the backhand." In order to have the racket in this position, it is sometimes worthwhile to bend down until the hand practically touches the floor, and I fancy most good players have barked their knuckles in this way at some time or other. It is when the preliminary swing merges into the actual striking of the shuttlecock that the wrist really comes into play, and at that stage it becomes the dominant factor in most strokes, governing direction and, to a great extent, regulating pace. Except in certain cases in which one movement of the wrist serves both purposes, these functions are not performed simultaneously, though the fraction of time separating them may be so minute as to be virtually imperceptible. Control of direction comes first. This is achieved by turning the wrist so that, without altering the general swing of the arm, the head of the racket is brought into position to guide the shuttlecock in the required direction. The result being that at the moment of impact, there may be quite a wide angle between the respective lines of advance of the racket head and the striker's arm. This can be clearly seen in Plate 15, where J.F. Devlin illustrates the play of the wrist in turning a low service at a sharp angle across the court. There are, of course, plenty of strokes in which the racket simply comes straight through with the arm, following the direction natural to the whole movement. But whenever the shuttlecock is sent in a less straightforward direction, it is the wrist that engineers the divergence. The action should be very free, and anyone with a really supple wrist should be able to turn the shuttlecock almost any way he pleases, irrespective of the movement of his arm. Accurate timing is again essential, for as the change of direction probably aims at surprise, it should come as late as possible. But if delayed just too long, the result will be a foozled shot, and usually a foul. The more closely you can time matters without overstepping the mark, the more effective will be the result, and I am sure that exceptionally deceptive players, such as F. Chesterton, owe a great deal of that quality to an ability to use this action of the wrist a shade later than other people without impairing the cleanness of the resulting stroke. The wrist can alter the elevation of a stroke as well as its general direction. Suppose, for instance, you are taking a full underhand swing, as though for a high, deep lob. By holding back the wrist at the last moment, you can, while allowing the arm to complete its full swing, turn the stroke into one which, instead of going high, just skims the net. The other sort of wrist action, affecting pace, follows that governing direction whenever two distinct movements are required. Sometimes, however, one is sufficient. For example, imagine a forehand stroke played about shoulder high. By letting your wrist give back just before the impact, you can both lessen the pace of your stroke and change its direction, turning the shuttlecock away to your right. Conversely, if you turn your wrist forward instead of letting it give, you can both increase pace and send the shuttlecock further to the left than it would otherwise have gone. But in many cases, one movement will not serve both purposes. Very often indeed, two movements of definitely contradictory nature are required. Still, considering a shoulder-high forehand stroke, suppose you wish to turn it straight down the line and also increase its pace. To do that, you must make two absolutely distinct movements of the wrist. First, turning it back for the sake of direction, and somewhat accentuating this so as to allow for counteraction, then tightening it and bringing it a shade forward again to gain pace. In practice, the whole action may pass so quickly as to look like one movement, but the division must actually be there. Wrist action can be used with equally good effect for either increasing or decreasing speed. By relaxing the muscles and letting the wrist give, that is to say, hold back from the shuttlecock, it is possible to play a very delicate stroke indeed, without checking the swing of the arm, which may be moving quite fast. On the other hand, the extra sting which distinguishes a really effective smash or a quick drive is imparted by the wrist. In either case, just as in controlling direction, accurate timing is of supreme importance. It is scarcely possible to overestimate the value of good wrist work, for, owing to the lightness of the implements used, the wrist can accomplish more by its own unaided power than in almost any other game. But it must be remembered that the sort of wrist work that in other games is used to produce cut or spin has practically no place in badminton. There are, it is true, a few strokes which may be played with a cutting or chopping action, but these are not at all typical of the game, and the actual work imparted to the shuttlecock is negligible. The real object of playing the stroke in this way being to disguise its direction, not to impart any peculiarity to its flight. The reason for this lies in the nature of the shuttlecock, which, flying base forward, cannot spin in any direction like a ball. The third and last part of a stroke is the follow-through. which is simply a continuation of the swing after the shuttlecock has left the racket. It is an essential feature of properly controlled strokes, though really a manifestation of, rather than an active factor in, the method of their production. What I mean is this: the follow-through, at the time it is actually in process, has no influence on the shuttlecock, which, having already left the strings, is unaffected by any further movement of the racket. But that further movement is itself the result of previous action which has affected the flight of the shuttlecock. Therefore, for all its importance, follow-through should be nothing more than the natural completion of action already begun, and any part of it that is not the direct outcome of that action is of no value. Thus, you will in no way strengthen a weakish stroke by giving your racket an extra twirl after its original impetus has begun to fade away. The additional power must be applied earlier, making the original impetus greater and the more pronounced follow-through a natural consequence. The extent of the follow-through varies, of course, with the force of the stroke. It may be a matter of only an inch or so in the case of a really delicate drop shot, in which the racket has hardly any way on it at the moment of impact, or it may be a very full sweep indeed. The important point is that it should be free, the driving force, whether great or small, being allowed to exhaust itself. Practically, the only exception to this rule concerns downward strokes when the net is so near as to be an obstacle. Then, naturally, the follow-through must be checked. In every detail of stroke production, you should strive to cultivate that elusive quality, good style. Many players regard this simply as an ornament, desirable enough in its way, but of no real assistance in winning a game. Such a superficial view is all wrong. Style has its roots far below the surface, and though it may not in itself be an actual source of strength, it is a sure indication of methods that make for strength, just as good follow-through indicates correct action preceding it. If a stroke looks awkward, you may be quite sure there is some defect in the way it is produced. That defect may not be so serious as actually to spoil the stroke, but it will react on the striker in some way, if only by making him expend a little more effort than would otherwise be necessary. And energy cannot be wasted with impunity in such a strenuous game as badminton. After all, the reason why a stroke played in good style looks nice is because it is executed in the easiest and most natural way, with all its component factors combining harmoniously to produce the greatest effect with the least effort. Style can easily be exaggerated, of course, but then it ceases to be good, the difference being much like that between a well-dressed and an overdressed woman. Exaggerated action in any particular, such as unnecessary flourishing of the racket, is to be avoided as carefully as the opposite extreme. If you watch someone like G.S.B. Mark, whose style I consider as nearly perfect as may be, you cannot fail to be struck by the naturalness of every movement and the entire absence of objectless elaboration. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of The Art of Badminton by Sir George Thomas Baronet. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4 The Smash. So far I have dealt with the general principles which govern, in a greater or less degree, all the strokes in the game. In this and succeeding chapters I shall go on to the application of these principles in the execution of particular strokes or classes of strokes. But everything I write here must be read in conjunction with what has been already laid down, whether regarding footwork or poise or use of arm and wrist. This will obviate any necessity for continual repetition of such rules as the advance of the right foot for backhand strokes, which I should otherwise have to detail afresh each time I considered any stroke in that category. But the importance of these fundamental rules must be borne in mind all the time. The beginner who has grasped them properly, and remembers to mold his actions on them, will find the development of any special stroke easy and natural, whereas anyone who neglects them will inevitably burden himself with faults of method which may prove very hard indeed to correct subsequently. A good equipment of strokes can be built up only on a thoroughly sound foundation. All the typical strokes in the game may be divided roughly into 4 classes: the smash or kill, the lob or clear, the drop and the drive. The smash is the chief attacking stroke in the game and is therefore of supreme importance. Ability to smash really well has a double value. In addition to the effect of the actual stroke when used, there is a perpetual menace to the opponent, whose tactics are often hampered by fear of it. Moreover, when compelled to give an opening for a smash, the more reason he has to fear its severity, the more likely he will be to concentrate on preparing to return it, and consequently the more liable to be caught off his guard if a drop be sent instead. Good smashing is a matter of pace and placing, with pace usually, but by no means always, the predominant consideration. To obtain great pace, distance from the shuttlecock must be very accurately judged, and the stroke timed to perfection, so that every aid to power, arm, wrist, and weight of body may simultaneously take effect. There is no stroke in which the general principles already enunciated are more vitally important. The shifting of the balance from the rearward to the advanced foot should be accentuated. Consequently, you should lean back at the start, and, as a natural corollary, you will finish with your body thrown well forward. First-class players vary a good deal in the extent to which they lean back before smashing. If you look at Plate 5, you will notice that GSB Mag does very little in that direction. But you can clearly see that the whole of his weight is on the right foot, which is what really matters. In marked contrast, G.A. Sauter used to lean back very decidedly, and the extra swing no doubt helped to produce the exceptional pace he imparted to the shuttlecock. As a general rule, those players who, like Sauter, smash round the head, as to which I shall have something to say presently, lean back further than those who, like Mag, smash from over the right shoulder. But in either case, I advise you to go well back, though not exaggeratedly so. The follow-through should be very pronounced, the head of the racket usually finishing quite near the floor, as in Plate 6, and particular attention must be given to bringing the influence of the wrist into play at exactly the right moment, for however much sheer strength you may put into your smash, it will lack that vital quality known as sting, unless a turn and tightening of the wrist gives the finishing touch. Although you should lean back more or less at the beginning of the stroke, that is only for the purpose of gaining extra momentum. If you have to reach back for the shuttlecock, you will strike it before the impetus of your forward swing can be properly effective. Therefore, time permitting, always get well under the shuttlecock for an overhead stroke. Without attempting to lay down any hard and fast rule, one may safely assert that the best effect usually results from meeting the shuttlecock at a point somewhere, roughly speaking, above the feet, not further back, I think, than the toe of the right or rearmost foot. I have already referred to a very important point of detail in regard to which first-class players may be divided into two schools, some bringing the racket up on the right of the body and smashing at a point somewhere above the right shoulder, others bringing it up behind the head and taking the shuttlecock, still with a forehand action of course, slightly to the left of the head. The exponents of each method include players whose smashing is so severe that I hesitate to say definitely that either is the better, but in my personal opinion, the second method, usually described as smashing round the head, is slightly the more effective. It seems to me to give a little extra scope to the wrist, especially when played across court from left to right, and to make anticipation of its direction a shade more difficult for the opponent. It also enables the striker to smash in certain positions, as when he succeeds in intercepting a not very high lob to his backhand corner, in which he could otherwise only drop or lob. On the other hand, players who smash in this way are apt to be relatively weak when forced to take a shot high and wide on the right. Although I consider this slightly the superior method, it comes more naturally to me to smash from over the right shoulder, and I usually do so, as I believe it generally pays better to develop one's own natural stroke than to copy that of someone else. I have, however, practiced smashing round the head sufficiently to enable me to resort to that method on occasion, and, to that extent, find it of considerable value, and I strongly advise every ambitious player, while concentrating more particularly on the type of smash that comes naturally to him, to acquire reasonable facility at the other also. The ideal player would, of course, be equally good at both. In a cross-court smash from left to right, played round the head, I sometimes bring the shuttlecock across a little more sharply by a slight change of grip, giving the racket about a quarter turn in the hand. But it is a very dangerous practice. The least error results in pulling the shuttlecock right out of court, and I am not disposed to recommend it, though I mention it for what it is worth. Only an experienced player should experiment with it anyway. The question of whether to jump when smashing is one in regard to which the practice of expert players differs very widely. Some jump habitually, others occasionally, others practically never. Personally, I am not a believer in doing so. The impetus of your swing, when smashing hard, will often bring your right foot away from the floor, but I think the left should be more or less firmly planted at the actual moment of striking. Of course, much depends on what you are doing at the time in the way of general movement about the court. You may play your smash while on the run, or when stepping backwards, or your position in the court may be such that you wish to move in some particular direction as soon as possible after playing your stroke. In such cases, neither of your feet will be stationary for more than a very brief fraction of time. But even so, I believe the left toe, at least, should be firmly in contact with the floor at the critical moment, while the more time you have for taking up the exact position you desire before smashing, the more firmly should your left foot be planted. Even though jumping may possibly add a trifle to the pace of a smash, I am not convinced of this, but players who jump habitually believe it, and it may be so. I feel sure it sacrifices something in the way of quick recovery of balance, rendering the striker a little more liable to be caught by a quick return before he has fully regained his poise. Anyway, if you do jump when smashing, remember that the principle of throwing your weight forward still operates in exactly the same way as though your feet were on the ground. If you look at plate 6, you will see that GSB Mac is finishing his smash with both feet in contact with the floor. He usually smashes with a very firm stance, exceptionally so perhaps, and the position of J.F. Devlin's feet in plate 9, with the right foot raised several inches and swinging forward, is probably more typical of the stroke as played by the majority of the experts. Although pace is important, you should be careful not to oversmash. By oversmashing, I mean hitting with such an effort as to rob yourself of proper control, either of the shuttlecock or of your own balance. For example, it will often happen that you get more or less in position to smash without having time to place yourself exactly as you would wish. If you then try to hit your absolute hardest, you will, owing to your imperfect position, be unduly forcing matters, and you will probably produce a less effective stroke than if you sacrifice a little power for the sake of better control. The percentage of error will certainly be higher, and even though your stroke may actually be a good one, you will be insecurely balanced for a fraction of a second, during which you will run the risk of being caught by a well-placed return. If you watch a player with an exceptionally severe smash, G.A. Sauter for instance, you cannot fail to be struck by the lack of apparent effort in his action. This is because the power put into the stroke is so beautifully controlled. Everything that counts is combined so harmoniously and timed so perfectly that not an ounce of energy is wasted in any direction. Subject to the preservation of proper control, however, you should certainly try to develop as much pace as possible. In placing your smash, you must learn to vary depth as well as direction. More often than not, it will be desirable to bring it down as near the net as possible, but in some situations, more frequently in singles than in doubles, a deep smash to the baseline is more effective than any other. The more abruptly you wish your smash to fall, the more wrist work you must put into it, for it is the wrist that flicks it down sharply over the net. It is also absolutely essential to be able to direct your smash from any position in court to either sideline. A smash down the center will produce excellent results on occasion, but that will naturally present no difficulty if you have command of the wider angle. Although pace is, generally speaking, the most important factor in smashing, it only achieves adequate results when helped by judicious placing, and many players who smash with real severity lose half the effect because they habitually hit in one direction. Compared to the smash proper, the backhand smash is of little importance. The weight of the body cannot be utilized to anything like the same extent. Consequently, the same pace cannot be obtained. For this reason, it is usually better, time permitting, as it so often does, to shift one's position sufficiently to play the shot forehanded. Nevertheless, situations often arise when a backhand smash is invaluable as a means of killing a loose shot. It should be played very snappily, the wrist and forearm doing most of the work. If you compare the finish of the backhand smash in plate 8 with the finish of the forehand smash in plates 6 and 9, you will clearly see that the bat is not used to anything like the same extent, though there is plenty of follow-through with the arm. The nearer the shuttlecock is to the net, the more completely should the wrist dominate the stroke. When very near the net, you are faced with the danger of touching it when following through, if you hit with any force. This is best obviated by turning your body completely away from the net just as you strike. By so doing, you counteract the actual follow-through, while still allowing the wrist to bring the shuttlecock sharply down. At any distance from the net, the backhand smash is usually in the nature of a pis-aller, and its effect is due to placing rather than to such pace as is possible. Personally, however, I am rather fond of a backhand stroke from the left-hand corner of the baseline, taken high and brought down sharply across the court. It is something less than a smash in the true sense of the word, but nearer to a smash than a drop. It should travel fairly fast and be almost purely a wrist stroke. Played correctly, and not too often, it may quite possibly take an opponent by surprise. As with the backhand, so in the case of a forehand smash near the net, one must guard against the danger of following through and hitting the net. Here it is not usually possible to turn away, so the follow-through must be checked by the wrist and the forearm, which spring back immediately the shuttlecock has been hit. Time and distance must be very accurately judged. At the risk of branding myself as a heretic, I am now going to advocate a proceeding in direct contravention of one of the accepted tenets of the game. The doctrine of keeping one's eye on the shuttlecock, or the ball, is rightly regarded as a fundamental rule of all games analogous to badminton. Nevertheless, judging by my own experience, it often pays to treat this rule a little loosely when smashing, or, more accurately, when preparing to smash, providing you have plenty of time for your stroke, and you often have when smashing. I think you can afford to take your eye off the shuttlecock for a fraction of a second in order to see exactly what your opponent is doing, and the position in which he is holding his racket. Most players have some spot a little more vulnerable to a smash than any other, and with many players this is a shifting point, varying according to the position in which the racket is held while awaiting the smash. When the racket is in front or a little to the left, the right shoulder may be the most suitable target, with the racket more to the right, perhaps the chest. Anyway, I find that I often get a very useful hint for placing a smash by looking at my opponent. But the eye must, of course, be brought back to the shuttlecock before one actually hits, and this unorthodox proceeding only pays when one has ample time and when the light is sufficiently good to enable one to switch one's eye back to the shuttlecock without any difficulty. In the early stages of a player's development, he should smash at almost every opportunity. Later he can learn to vary his game to the best advantage, but at the start he cannot do better than take for his motto, hit downwards and hit hard whenever possible. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5 of The Art of Badminton by Sir George Thomas, Baronet. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. The Lob or Clear. Badminton players usually speak of clearing strokes rather than of lobs, but the latter term has the advantage of familiarity to players of other games and is rather more convenient for purposes of description, so I shall use it here. The lob is a staple defensive stroke in the game, though it can also be a valuable attacking weapon on occasion. Normally, the most important thing in lobbing is to keep a good length, that is, to send the shuttlecock so far to the back of the court that if allowed to drop, it would fall within a few inches of the back line. To lob short, except purposely in particular situations, with which I shall deal presently, is one of the worst faults in the game, and one of the most prevalent. Beginners seldom make use of the full length of the court, and even experts often sin in this respect. As a matter of fact, a tendency to lob short has always been one of my own worst failings, and I know, by sad experience, how very expensive it may be if not firmly corrected. Even an extra inch or two in the length of your lob may make all the difference to your opponent's chance of bringing off a really effective smash. To beginners, I have no hesitation in saying, risk lobbing out rather than short. On balance, it will prove much the less expensive mistake. Even if your lob would fall just out, it is by no means certain that your opponent will leave it. Unless he judges distance exceptionally well, he will often take a shot which would actually fall just over the line, and the very uncertainty of whether to leave it or not will sometimes cause him to make a half-hearted weak return. On the other hand, a lob of poor length is likely to be an absolute gift to an opponent who smashes well. Therefore, I repeat, risk lobbing too far rather than not far enough. If you find you are losing points by doing so, it will be the easier fault to correct. While good length is almost always required, the height to which you should lob varies considerably. You may want to give yourself extra time for getting back into position. This is one of the chief defensive virtues of a lob, in which case you will naturally send the shuttlecock pretty high. On the other hand, you may want your stroke to occupy as little time as possible, so as to take advantage of some unfavorable circumstance in your opponent's position, when you have drawn him right up to the net, for example. In such a case, you will lob as low as possible, consistently with keeping the shuttlecock outside your opponent's reach. This demands very careful judgment, for if your lob travels just too low, thereby coming within his reach, it may, so far from putting him into difficulties, give him an easy opening. Accurately judged, however, so as to be safe from interception while giving your opponent the minimum time for getting back to it, such a lob is a very useful means of attack and frequently paves the way for a winning stroke. It may even, on occasion, be an actual winner itself. You should therefore practice lobbing at widely different angles of elevation so as to be able to give the shuttlecock the most suitable sort of trajectory at any given moment. The majority of lobs, though, are defensive, or at least non-committal strokes. These should always be high, and the necessity for a really good length cannot be overemphasized. The higher you send your lob, the straighter it will fall. This is itself often a useful quality, as it is difficult to smash cleanly when the shuttlecock is descending in practically a plump line. On the other hand, a very high lob has this possible disadvantage. If, in aiming at a very good length, you just overdo it, your opponent can easily judge whether to leave the shot alone. As the steeper the angle of descent, the more certainly can one estimate the exact point at which the shuttlecock will reach the floor. While full length is always requisite in a high lob, it may or may not be important in one of lower trajectory. This depends entirely on the nature of your opponent's position, the facility with which he can turn, and so forth. The nearer you place to the baseline, the longer the shuttlecock will be on the way, and it will sometimes pay you to give your opponent a shorter distance to travel and a shorter time in which to cover it, while at other times the greater length may be more important than the saving of a minute fraction of a second. Generally speaking, I think time more important than length in this class of lob, but that is by no means a universal rule. There is another type of lob in which length is not only not essential, but actually to be avoided. This is a sort of half lob, used almost exclusively in playing against the back and front formation in doubles. The idea is to draw the player at the back away from his proper base. Consequently, subject only to avoiding the net player, the shorter the stroke and the lower its trajectory, the better. To be effective, this stroke must be very exactly controlled, and it should be assiduously practiced. Obviously, a shot of this type can, as a rule, only be played straight down one or the other sideline, for unless the net player be out of position, there will be no opening for directing it across the court. All other lobs, however, should be played as readily across the court as straight down it. Few players vary their game sufficiently in this respect. Even among quite useful players, and much more so among beginners, there is a tendency to direct lobs straight down the court almost every time. Anything stereotyped of that kind should be carefully avoided, for variety is one of the main essentials in every phase of badminton tactics. As far as the actual technique of lobbing is concerned, there is not a great deal to be said. The lob is essentially a plain, straightforward stroke, and the player who keeps to the general principles of stroke production enunciated in earlier chapters should meet with no special difficulty. Judgment of the exact strength required for keeping an accurate length is, of course, a matter of practice and experience. A good length lob from the back of the court requires plenty of power, and it is therefore imperative to use the feet and the weight of the body correctly, but the method of doing so has already been fully described. The follow-through should be very pronounced in the case of underhand lobs, somewhat less so with those played overhead. For the ordinary overhead lob from the back of the court, the preliminary action should be absolutely indistinguishable from that of a smash. Only the wrist, instead of being brought over and downwards as the shuttlecock is struck, follows straight through with the arm, and sometimes, though not always, the shuttlecock is taken at a point a little further back in relation to the body than in the case of a smash. A stroke which many quite good players execute very badly is the backhand overhead lob from the back of the court. They seem to find great difficulty in hitting hard enough to secure a good length. The trouble is nearly always due to incorrect footwork, resulting in cramped movement of the arm and faulty timing. If you are weak at this particular stroke, you should, therefore, pay careful attention to the position of your feet and to your distance from the shuttlecock. Perhaps you need to bring your right foot a little further across, or to keep your feet a little wider apart, or possibly your mistake consists in taking the shuttlecock just too near you, or just too far away, or just too high or too low, to get the full benefit of your swing. Test these points thoroughly, and do not be satisfied until you find the exact position in which you can hit with the most power and the least effort. Like the backhand smash, this is mainly an arm and wrist stroke, there being less scope for utilizing the weight of the body than in the corresponding forehand stroke. So your position must be such as to allow your arm the freest possible movement. Personally, I like taking the shuttlecock practically as high as I can reach it, and I think most first-class players agree in this respect. But H.S. Huber, who plays this stroke exceptionally well, takes the shuttlecock a good deal lower down, making particular use of the forearm as the source of power. Many good players find it helpful to slide the thumb up the handle, as J.F. Devlin has done in Play 3. Try this for yourself, and if you find it suits you, it does not suit everyone. I, for one, never use the thumb in this way. Cultivate it. Anyway, remember that this high backhand lob is one of the most essential strokes in the game, and if you are weak at it, the defect will inevitably give your opponent countless openings for attack. So take pains to master it thoroughly. You can sometimes, if the shuttlecock is not too far to your left, save yourself trouble by playing the stroke with a forehand action, bringing the racket up in the same way as for a smash round the head. But it will constantly be too wide on your left for this, and the only safe course is to practice the stroke until it is no longer a bugbear. Another type of lob which depends on power of stroke is that taken low near the baseline. Here again, the prime necessity is correct footwork. Without that, you can neither swing with sufficient freedom nor use your weight properly, and in no other stroke is it so essential to use the weight of the body. For this reason, it is really more difficult on the forehand than on the backhand. For on the backhand, providing always the feet be correctly placed, the full weight of the body comes into the stroke more naturally. In either case, the swing of the arm must be absolutely free, and the follow-through very pronounced. On the backhand especially, I think it is a good thing to let the shuttlecock drop quite low before hitting it, though of course not so low as to prevent your swinging freely underneath it, as you then seem to get the best value out of your swing and follow-through. When you have to play this stroke, that is to say, it is one to be avoided as far as possible, as if able to intercept the shuttlecock at an earlier stage, you will nearly always save yourself difficulty by doing so. The ability to lob well in reply to a smash, which can only just be reached, is a great defensive asset, but difficult to acquire. Most players come forward automatically after smashing, and nothing is more tiring than being forced back again by a good length lob in reply. But the lob must be of really good length, otherwise it is suicidal. The difficulty of attaining a good length with these strokes is due to the fact that it is often impossible to make much use of one's weight, partly because one has so little time to assume a favorable position, partly because one is usually moving at right angles to the direction in which one desires to hit. Therefore, the stroke is generally governed by the arm and wrist alone, and depends for its power on a quick swing and a long follow-through. H.N. Marriott was extraordinarily good at this stroke, and it was one of his greatest assets in a single, while of the younger generation of experts, J.F. Devlin and H.R.C. Martin use it with admirable effect. But it is, as I say, a difficult shot to master, and is worse than useless if not accurately controlled. Owing to the shape of the shuttlecock, which in certain strokes particularly has a trajectory quite different to that of a ball, it is possible to play a good length lob from almost under the net. This is one of the most typical strokes in the game, and is immensely useful as a means of returning a close drop shot. But for this resource, one would almost always be compelled to reply to a good drop shot with another, so that the player who got in first with an accurate stroke of this type could wait confidently at the net for the return. The possibility of playing a good lob in such a position opens up the game enormously. This particular lob should always be sent very high, practically as high as possible, so as to give ample time for the turnover of the shuttlecock to take effect. A few players use a peculiar straight arm action for overhead forehand lobs, indeed for all overhead forehand strokes, straightening the arm as soon as the racket has been carried back and keeping it straight throughout the remainder of the swing. The result is something like the action of a bowler at cricket, and the point is that the head of the racket coming up so far behind the body, the striker has a much bigger backward reach than in the case of a normal overhead stroke. Therefore, he can afford to keep that much further forward in court, and he thus saves himself a certain expenditure of energy in going back to take good length lobs. It is, I think, a very useful method to have at command for emergencies, but the action is stiff and does not lend itself to attacking strokes, and I should certainly not advise anyone to adopt it for general purposes of overhead work. Though used at the right time, it may be a most valuable means of conserving energy. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6 of The Art of Badminton by Sir George Thomas Baronet. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6 Drop Shots. The term drop shot, by which is meant a stroke that causes the shuttlecock to fall just over the net, covers so varied a category of strokes that it is impossible to describe them all in detail. A drop shot may be played from any part of the court, at any height from the floor, and directed so as to cross the net at any point. Accurate strength is, of course, the main essential, and this will vary between quite a solid blow from the back of the court and the most delicate touch near the net. Nothing but practice can teach that perfect control of strength required for playing good drop shots. As regards the actual method of playing this species of stroke, the golden rule is to hit firmly, however short the distance you wish the shuttlecock to travel, even when you take it within an inch or two of the net cord. Only by so doing can you maintain the absolute control which is imperative. This is one of the directions in which beginners commonly fail. Desiring to hit very lightly, they dab at the shuttlecock in an irresolute sort of way, producing a jerky, ill-guided stroke. The action of a well-played drop shot is perfectly smooth and, as I say, firm, the velvet glove touch, in fact. This must be preserved even in the most delicate of strokes, when the actual weight of the blow is no more than that of a feather, and the better it is preserved, the more accurate will be the striker's control. It is this combination of firmness and delicacy that constitutes the distinctive touch of a really good player. There are, it is true, a few drop shots in which the racket does little more than meet the shuttlecock and allow it to rebound, as when a player, quite near the net, intercepts a smash or a really fast drive. But in almost all such strokes, a certain amount of wrist work, in which this quality of touch is supremely important, comes into play, and even in the rare cases where it is absent, the racket must be held firmly, so as to control the angle of return. In playing a drop shot from quite near the net, that is, usually in reply to a drop shot by your opponent, you should normally take the shuttlecock as high as possible. The nearer it is to the net court when you play it, the easier will it be for you to keep your return very close to the net, and the less time will your opponent have to reach it. Also, the higher the shuttlecock is when you take it, the wider option you retain up to the latest possible moment of playing some other stroke instead of a drop shot. I want, however, to qualify this advice in one respect. If your opponent's drop shot has been cut so fine as to touch the net before trickling over, you will often do better to let it fall some distance, clear of the bottom of the net perhaps, before attempting to return it, even though you may be near enough to take it sooner. When a shuttlecock hits the tape and topples over, it frequently comes in contact with the mesh of the net on the further side, and if this happens just as you hit, it will most inevitably spoil your stroke. Moreover, this second contact with the net will often turn the shuttlecock an inch or two outwards, thus allowing you an easier angle for your return. And in any case, by waiting, you give your eye time to adjust itself to whatever deflection there has been in the path of the shuttlecock. But, subject to this particular consideration, I believe strongly in taking the shuttlecock at as high a level as possible. When playing a drop shot from very near the net and rather low, many players seem to find it easier to place across the net rather than straight. From a tactical point of view, however, the straight shot will often be the more effective, so it should be practiced assiduously until it can be controlled as accurately as the other. Never in any situation be content with the ability to play a shot in one direction only, however perfectly you may be able to place in that direction. Command of variety is always a prime necessity. In the case of a drop shot played from quite near the net, you should have a double aim, to make the shuttlecock just skim the tape, and also to cause it to fall as close as possible on the further side of the net. But as you get further back in court, you will find that these aims come more or less definitely into conflict. For instance, if you want an overhead drop shot from near the baseline to fall very close to the net, you must play it with a fairly high trajectory so that it drops sharply and is already falling almost perpendicularly when it crosses the net. Obviously, such a stroke needs to be judged with extreme accuracy, and if you send the shuttlecock even 2 or 3 inches too far before it commences to drop, you may possibly give your opponent the easiest of sitters. The safer stroke is one of lower trajectory, approaching the net along a gentler curve, but this will not fall so abruptly on the further side, and may consequently be less effective than a perfectly accurate drop of the other type. Sometimes one, sometimes the other form of stroke will be the more suitable according to the position of your opponent and the exact purpose you have in view. You should therefore practice dropping from most parts of the court, but more especially from far back, with trajectory of varying elevation. A point to remember in this connection is that the nearer to the net your shot is falling, the closer is likely to be your opponent's return, should he reply with another drop. It is much harder to drop the shuttlecock just over the net from a distance of 3 or 4 feet than from the same number of inches. If therefore your position is such that a very close drop shot in reply to your own is likely to put you into trouble, it will pay you better to adopt the stroke of low trajectory which, while just skimming the net, does not fall very abruptly on the further side. A stroke of this description may be a perfectly good drop shot, even though it would pass beyond the short service line before reaching the floor, and more useful, at the right time, than one dropping within a few inches of the net. I regard this as a very important point to bear in mind when angling for an opening, especially in a single. A drop shot naturally travels slowly. For that reason, it is highly important not to disclose the intention sooner than necessary, and the further the striker is from the net, the greater the importance of this. A drop shot from the back of the court, played in such a way that the opponent cannot know it is coming until it has left the striker's racket, may be extremely effective. Precisely the same stroke, but with the intention given away in advance, will usually be worse than useless. You must therefore be careful to shape for a drop shot in exactly the same way as you would for a smash or a drive or whatever the most likely alternative stroke may be. Before an overhead drop shot, for example, lean back as far, swing your racket as freely, and place your feet in the same way as though you intended a full power smash. The further you can carry the resemblance, the better effect you will obtain. When you do check your racket, avoid doing so with a jerk. Stroke the shuttlecock rather than jab it. Practice drop shots varying their direction without altering the preliminary action from every part of the court, and learn to make them in reply to difficult as well as easy strokes. It is, for example, necessary to be able to drop accurately in reply to a smash. This is one of the most valuable strokes in the game, as it is so often the means of turning defense into attack, but terribly dangerous if directed a few inches too high. Its success depends entirely on wrist control, and the timing must be very perfect indeed, especially when the angle of return is deflected. As a start, when cultivating this stroke, a beginner will do well to return the shuttlecock at the most natural angle, concentrating his attention on keeping it very low over the net. But as he gains greater control, he must learn also to vary the direction of his stroke. Another difficult but important drop shot is that from near the floor in the backhand corner at the rear of the court. This should seldom be used in match play, except under stress of necessity. The shuttlecock, whenever possible, being intercepted at some earlier stage in its flight, where a less difficult and dangerous stroke can be played instead. But since the necessity cannot always be avoided, the shot should be mastered in practice games, and anyone who can play it accurately to either end of the net will be able to extricate himself from many an otherwise almost hopeless predicament, though he must be careful to swing exactly as though meaning to drive hard or clear to the back of the court. In this stroke, and in fact in all drop shots played under difficulties, the correct use of the wrist is almost all important. Of overhead drop shots, those played from the back of the court are much the most valuable. Further forward in court, the more aggressive smash is almost always to be preferred, and the nearer you are to the net, the less frequently will a drop shot yield the best results. Even quite close to the net, however, a well-disguised drop shot may sometimes be an even more probable winner than a smash. In such a case, success depends mainly on the element of surprise. So the pretense of smashing must be carefully simulated, the arm coming forward with a good swing, and the racket being checked entirely by the wrist. It may be that I am harping with unnecessary persistence on this necessity of giving away no information during the preliminary action of a drop shot, but the principle is so vital that I feel it is scarcely possible to lay too much stress on it. Drop shots require so little force that the natural tendency is to play them with hardly any swing, but they lose the greater part of their effect if the preliminary action distinguishes them in any way from alternative strokes. From the back of the court, the overhead drop shot may be used much more constantly than when near the net, but even there it can easily be overworked. It is sometimes useful to play an overhead drop shot on the forehand with a chopping action, not with any idea of putting work on the shuttlecock, but as a means of helping to disguise direction. In playing the stroke in this way, you should approach your racket to the shuttlecock exactly as though you intended an ordinary plain stroke, and then chop sharply with the wrist as you strike. The mere fact of chopping across the shuttlecock instead of making a plain hit will lessen the force of your stroke. Consequently, you can hit harder than for a plain stroke without making the shuttlecock travel any further, which is in itself an aid to deception. Played across the court from near the forehand side line and properly timed, this is a particularly useful stroke in a single, since your opponent must be ready to deal with a smash down the line, and the deceptive angle of flight may catch him napping. But it should be used sparingly, as its effect soon wears off with familiarity. A few players use a similar device in dropping overhead across the court from the left, again with the forehand action. This also is a useful variant to the ordinary stroke, but a good deal more difficult than the corresponding stroke from the right. It is worked with a flick of the wrist rather than a chop, and may be helped by a partial turn of the racket in the hand. Its effect also wears off very quickly if used at all constantly against an observant opponent. Similarly, when playing underhand drop shots, especially from quite near the net, the action of cutting may occasionally be employed with quite good effect, either on the forehand or on the backhand. But again, it must be remembered that the sole idea is to send the shuttlecock in an unexpected direction, not to put any spin to it. This practice usually adds to the difficulty of the stroke, thus increasing the likelihood of error. So it should be used with restraint. In fact, most drop shots, which come into the category of trick strokes, are double-edged weapons, almost as dangerous to the striker as to his opponents, sometimes more so. By trick shots I mean those in which some more or less elaborate movement is employed in order to deceive. No player should attempt this until he has a thorough mastery of all the ordinary strokes. Till then, he should cultivate simple methods, fixing his attention more on the necessity of not giving information than on any effort designed actually to mislead. But while eschewing unnecessary tricks, he should learn as varied a selection of natural drop shots as possible, taking them high or low on either side and guiding them from any part of the court in any direction. Compared to the smash, the drop shot seldom scores outright, but, judiciously exploited, it is a fruitful source of openings for the more decisive stroke, and this is normally its proper function in attack. As a defensive weapon, it has the merit of limiting the opponent's action and slowing down his attack, while, as already pointed out, it is frequently the means of passing from defense to attack. It should be used plentifully in the process of angling for position, though care should be taken not to employ it too constantly. Though no more important than other strokes, drop shots certainly have a peculiar fascination of their own. This is perhaps partly due to the fact that there is nothing really similar to them in any other game, and in that sense they are essentially characteristic of badminton, while the delicacy of touch required in their execution also appeals very strongly to the artistic instinct. However that may be, some players are undoubtedly much too fond of drop shots and use them altogether too frequently, and if you find yourself developing such a tendency, you should repress it firmly. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7 of The Art of Badminton by Sir George Thomas, Baronet. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. The Drive. Although this should be one of the standard strokes of the game, it is greatly neglected by the majority of players. On the backhand especially, the average club player contents himself, as far as underhand strokes are concerned, with either lobbing or dropping. This is sheer waste of a most useful alternative. It is true that the drive should not be used so often as the lob or the drop, but played at the right moment, it is a most valuable weapon, particularly effective as a means of turning attack into defense. Pace and low trajectory are the essential attributes. A half-hearted drive seldom accomplishes anything. All the aids to pace already described, footwork, follow-through, etc., come into the stroke, but, in driving, the arm should do more work than the wrist, the forearm particularly in the case of a forehand drive, the whole arm in the case of one on the backhand. If you keep the shuttlecock really low over the net, you can, from anywhere towards the back of the court, hit as hard as you please without danger of driving over the baseline, and, properly timed, a drive, especially on the backhand, can be made to travel surprisingly fast. Beyond the special influence of the arm, the only point requiring particular emphasis is the importance of a very free follow-through. In the case of a very hard-hit drive, the follow-through sometimes carries the racket a surprisingly long way. This is illustrated in Plate 14, which shows the finish of a backhand drive across the court. I must admit I had no idea my racket had swung so far round, and I fancy only an exceptionally hard-hit stroke would produce quite so pronounced a follow-through. I had, as a matter of fact, put all the power I could into the drive, but I did not consciously exaggerate the action. The swing of the body in a cross-court drive naturally accentuates the movement of the arm, In the case of a drive straight down the line, the follow-through would not pull the racket round in the same way, the action finishing with the head of the racket pointing more or less directly along the path of the shuttlecock. As already stated, the drive is not suitable for such constant use as the alternative strokes, but in certain situations it is the most valuable of all. It is particularly deadly as a return to a deep smash, if you can get to the shuttlecock in time to take it at a height of 2 or 3 feet from the floor, directing it to the opposite side of the court to that from which your opponent has smashed. Also, in a single, when your opponent is out of position, or in a double, when your opponent's combination has been momentarily disorganized, a drive may be the only stroke speedy enough to reach an undefended spot. On the other hand, the drive, because of its pace, is a dangerous stroke, for, if intercepted, it may come back unpleasantly soon. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8 of The Art of Badminton by Sir George Thomas, Baronet. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8 Service. This is unquestionably one of the most difficult phases of the game. It is a peculiarity of badminton, as compared to other games of similar type, that the server, however perfect his control of the shuttlecock, opens the rally at a distinct disadvantage, because in addition to having to play into a restricted area, his stroke must be of a defensive nature. True, he may occasionally score by lobbing over an opponent who, anticipating a short service, commits himself too soon to a forward rush, or, conversely, a short service may now and again, but very rarely, catch on the wrong foot an opponent who has prematurely thrown back his balance in readiness to kill a lob. But any success of this kind is due to the opponent's error, and not to any inherent virtue in the stroke itself. Normally, therefore, the service is purely defensive, and extreme accuracy is essential to avoid giving an opening for a winning return. The actual strokes used in service may be divided roughly into 3 classes: the short service, which just skims the net and falls as near the short service line as possible, the lob to the long service line, and a long, low service directed so as to enter the service court far back and usually at rather an abrupt angle. For the sake of convenience, this last type of service may be called a drive, though it seldom travels fast enough to be really worth the name. Further variety is added by the fact that while most players serve on the forehand, a few use the backhand, and a few others use the forehand in the right court and the backhand in the left. Although the execution of these various strokes has, in the main, been described in previous chapters, there are 1 or 2 points that call for special consideration. The handling of the shuttlecock, for instance. The shuttlecock should be held lightly, base downwards, of course, by the feathers. It is, I think, immaterial whether you just take hold of the tips of 1 or 2 feathers or whether you hold them lower down. But it is important not to touch the string that binds the feathers. This string is coated with some form of adhesive and is apt to become moist, and if it sticks to your fingers ever so slightly, it may deflect the shuttlecock sufficiently to ruin your stroke. First-class players exhibit surprising differences of method in bringing racket and shuttlecock together for service. Some bring the racket almost into contact with the shuttlecock before releasing the latter from the fingers. Some let the shuttlecock fall perpendicularly for a foot or more before striking it. Others throw it sideways, and a few, but very few I think, actually throw it upwards for an inch or 2, waiting for it to drop again before hitting it. Where such differences exist, as they do even among the few whom I regard as conspicuously good servers, I have no wish to label any one system as the best. But it is worth noting a few points characteristic of these different methods. Take first the plan of holding the shuttlecock until the last moment before hitting it. This seems to help towards accurate control of a short service. At any rate, it is the method used by several players who rather shine at delivering this particular service. But it is not equally suitable for a lob service. Those who use it may score occasionally with a lob over the head of an opponent too eager to rush in, but only because the lob is so unexpected, not because it is good of its kind. I cannot think of any player who serves in this way whose lob services are really good. Generally, they are distinctly bad, traveling too low for safety, and unless catching the opponent off his guard, they can usually be killed outright. As a result, the server can risk a lob only very occasionally, just often enough to keep his opponent guessing, and must serve short almost always. And if, for any reason, his short service breaks down on some occasion, he has little else to fall back on. On the other hand, this style of service has, when working well, much to recommend it, especially for the net player in a back and front combination who, apart from any question of the method of delivery, should serve low much more often than not. The server who adopts this method should stand close to the short service line. It is not suitable, therefore, for singles, and must be careful not to keep hold of the shuttlecock so long that he carries it onto his racket instead of making a clean hit, a foul to which some of the exponents of this form of service are, quite unwittingly of course, rather prone. While this method of delivery is quite distinctive, the others merge into each other. Some good players simply let the shuttlecock drop from their fingers, but most, I think, throw it a little to the right, perhaps only an inch or two, perhaps a good deal more. Personally, I think the most natural action, and that which enables you to vary your service most widely, is to throw the shuttlecock about 6 inches to your right and hit it as soon as it is dropping vertically. But it is really a matter of taste. By throwing the shuttlecock further to the side, you can increase the angle at which it approaches the service court, and this is, of course, an advantage in the case of a drive service. This is the theory on which those players work who serve from the forehand in the right-hand court and from the backhand in the other. Standing as near as possible to the sideline, they throw the shuttlecock quite wide, so that it is actually struck at a point somewhere outside the boundaries of the court, and in consequence it naturally enters the service court at a relatively wide angle. This idea is undoubtedly sound as far as it goes, but as a drive service is the only one in which a very wide angle is desirable. It is the only form of service benefited by this style of delivery, while ability to vary the service is certainly hampered. To my thinking, a method of delivery which lends itself to variety is likely to pay better in the long run than one specially designed for a particular type of service, even though the latter may undeniably conduce to greater accuracy in that particular kind of service. But it is a point in regard to which I have no inclination to be dogmatic. If you do adopt this very wide delivery, you will find it an advantage to stand rather far back in court, not only because that enables you to increase the pace without danger of serving a fault, but also because a low, deep smash is the return you will have most to fear. Though I think it is a mistake to go to the extreme, as some do, of standing only just inside the long service line, as that gives the opponent too good an opening for an effective drop shot. Anyhow, whatever action you find most suitable to your own style, be careful not to vary it when varying your service. For instance, do not throw the shuttlecock well to your right for a drive service, and let it fall straight before sending a lob. I have dealt with this general principle before, but at risk of laboring the point, I want to rub it in very particularly in regard to service. The server can only overcome the initial disadvantage of his position by serving in such a way as to convey no preliminary indication of his intention. This applies not only to the action of serving itself, but to the server's position in court and every other detail of his method of delivery. I have in mind one first-class player who normally serves from near the short service line. For a drive service, however, he retires about 3 yards, and though he executes the service very well, his opponent is naturally always prepared for it. Another has a habit of looking at the roof before serving a lob, a relic doubtless of practice in a hall cursed with awkwardly placed girders, but a most useful source of information to the opponent. Others also have their special idiosyncrasies, less pronounced but to some extent eloquent of intention. Anything of the kind is a totally unnecessary self-imposed handicap, and if you know that you have some such weakness, you should spare no pains to eradicate it. A little concentration is all you require for the purpose. I do not mean that you should always serve from the same position in court. In doubles, at any rate, I am a firm believer in varying it, especially against certain opponents. What I mean is that when you change your position, the alteration should not in any way govern your choice of the type of service you will deliver. In an ordinary double, I consider that a good position from which to serve is near the sideline, and about 3 feet behind the short service line, but as a means of variety it is often useful to stand quite near the central line, and from either position you should be able to deliver any kind of service with equal facility. The net player, in a back and front combination, should almost invariably serve from near the center line and normally from quite near the short service line. Against certain opponents, however, it may be found advisable to fall back a couple of feet or so. This particularly against anyone who, while quick in getting on to a short service, is fond of a sort of half-and-half return, a little deeper than an ordinary drop shot, but a good deal shorter than the average push stroke. This may be a very awkward return for the net player to deal with if standing close up to the line, while she is quite likely to be in her partner's way if leaving the return to him. Whereas, by dropping back a couple of feet, she can generally take this particular shot of return herself without much difficulty. In a single, the natural position of the server is near the center line and about midway between the two service lines, and I do not think anything is to be gained by attempting to vary it. Some few players do occasionally serve from near the sideline, even in a single, but I feel sure that anything they gain by being able to serve from a wider angle is more than counterbalanced by the danger of being beaten by a quick return to the other side of the court. This return very possibly taking effect before the server has had time to reach his proper defensive base somewhere near the center. As already indicated, accuracy is the supreme quality in the service. In the case of a short service, the shuttlecock must not only pass as low as possible over the tape, it must also begin to drop immediately it has crossed the net. Otherwise, an alert opponent will easily rush it. This accuracy depends quite as much on confidence and concentration as on actual skill. Therefore, think only of the stroke itself. Do not wonder whether your opponent means to rush it, and above all, do not let the memory of any previous weak services weigh on your mind. If the best of servers allows his confidence to crack, he loses accuracy at once. When I advise you to think only of the stroke itself, I refer only to the actual moment of striking. Up to that moment, you should keep your attention on your opponent, noting whether he is standing a little further forward than usual or anything of that sort. Another important point is this. You will now and again meet a player who, quite unintentionally, gets on the move before you deliver your service. Theoretically, of course, he should be pulled up by the umpire for this breach of the rules, but the umpire cannot very well watch the server, the shuttlecock, and the striker out all at the same time. And it is quite 100-to-1 against his noticing your opponent's transgression. So if you think anything of the sort is happening, you should watch your opponent carefully to make sure that he is standing in conformity with the rules, and if he should start to move before you actually dispatch the shuttlecock, you can then, if necessary, send a different service to that you intended, thus turning your opponent's illegal movement against himself. In any case, take your time over service. Hurried action nearly always makes for inaccuracy. And if you feel you are getting a little flustered, be all the more deliberate, without of course carrying deliberation so far as to be irritating or balking to your adversary. Some players, who have difficulty in checking a natural tendency to serve hastily, find it helpful to count up to 3 before striking the shuttlecock, and I fancy many others might improve their service by following this plan, though they should, at the same time, take care not to go to the other extreme of exaggeratedly slow action. The lob service should usually go pretty high, though length is the chief consideration. As with the ordinary lob, it is generally better to risk hitting too deep rather than too short, especially in doubles where the limit is so curtailed. Both the lob and the short service should be varied freely as to direction, with due regard, however, to any peculiarities of the player served to, whether he smashes better over his right shoulder or over his left, for instance. Some players find a short service which comes comparatively straight much easier to rush than one crossing the net at an oblique angle. Any peculiarity of this kind must be made use of, and even if you do not know of it before a match, you should, by varying your service judiciously, discover it pretty quickly. When facing an unfamiliar opponent, it is worth testing him for any weakness of the sort, even though you may throw away a hand or two in the process. You must also naturally adapt your service to your opponent's position in court. If he practically toes the line, ready to pounce on a short service, the obvious counter is to lob pretty constantly. If he waits back for a smash, you can serve short with less danger. The drive service, unlike the other species, does not lend itself to variety of direction. Whether from the right or from the left court, it should be aimed to fall as near the center line as possible, usually near the junction of the center and long service lines, though sometimes it may be shortened a little with advantage, and the trajectory should invariably be low. The idea of a drive service is always to keep the shuttlecock outside the service court, and thus away from the opponent until the latest possible moment in its flight. It is therefore easier to deliver from the sidelines. But certain players seem bothered by it when it comes from near the center line, that is to say, practically straight down the middle of the court. The drive service is very dangerous against an opponent who smashes well at a comparatively low elevation, especially in the right-hand court against anyone who smashes round his head. On the average, it is, I think, much less dangerous from the left-hand court, as few players kill a wide and comparatively low stroke on the forehand really well. But curiously enough, the number of players who make use of the service from the left-hand court is very small. I think those who cut this type of service out of their game almost entirely make a great mistake, for if not intercepted at any early stage, it gives little opportunity for a really attacking reply. Though, as with the ordinary drive, this service should certainly be used sparingly, for it loses most of its effect if overworked. Moreover, it is little better than suicidal, if not very accurate. Most strong players serve with a perfectly plain action, but a conspicuous exception is R. Durovray, who governs the direction of his service by cutting across the shuttlecock. This action apparently yields very good results in his case, but I should not be surprised to find that he could serve just as well without it, and I certainly do not think it is to be recommended to the ordinary player. Having said that, I must admit that I occasionally use it myself when wishing to bring a short service very sharply across the court, from either right or left. But I seldom feel that it is really worthwhile, and I should be very chary of using it at a critical moment, unless particularly anxious to vary what I had been doing. Constantly practiced, however, the extra uncertainty which accompanies its occasional adoption, as in my case, would doubtless disappear. But even so, I doubt whether there is really anything to be gained by it. If it were especially hard to anticipate, that would, of course, be a very important consideration, but I do not think it is. Anyone who does practice it must be careful not to let the wrist action develop into a feint, which would, of course, be against the rules. While on this subject, I cannot too strongly urge beginners to make quite sure that the action they use is absolutely fair in every way. It is very easy to fall into the habit of unconsciously serving just too high, and very difficult indeed to fall out again. It is a much more common fault than it should be in all grades of badminton, and the mischief is that it usually goes unpunished. One reason is that so many matches are played without an umpire, and it is then a very delicate matter to question an opponent's delivery. The most one can do is to ask him to be careful, and as his fault is quite involuntary, he probably only thinks one over fussy. Even when there is an umpire, a foul service, unless very pronounced, is extremely difficult to judge from the chair. Of course, nobody consciously serves unfairly, but a foul delivery is none the less disconcerting on that account, and any player who has reason to think that his service is considered even doubtful should, however confident of his fairness he may be in his own mind, get some capable judge to watch and criticize him frankly, and if told that there really is ground for complaint, he should spare no pains in correcting his action, even at the expense of a decided falling off in the quality of his service. Prevention is, however, much better than cure, and a little care in regard to this matter during the development of a player's style may save him an immense amount of bother later on. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of The Art of Badminton by Sir George Thomas, Baronet. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9 Return of Service. It being admitted that the server opens the rally at a disadvantage, the first consideration of the striker out should be to make that disadvantage as real as possible by being prepared to exact just retribution for the slightest lapse. Success in this direction will depend to a great extent on quickness of thought and perception as well as of movement, and this is, of course, a faculty more highly developed in some players than in others. But position in court is also a very important factor. The service which calls for the most prompt response is a short one, This is particularly true in the case of a weakish service, one not so bad as to offer a really easy chance, but just weak enough to give a possible opening if pounced on sufficiently quickly. In dealing with a service of this character, everything depends on taking it as soon as possible after it has crossed the net. So in order to make the most of possible chances, the striker out should stand well forward. In fact, as near the short service line as he can, without, this is an important stipulation, sacrificing the ability to get back in time to smash a good length lob. Here, naturally, the individual must gauge and be guided by his own physical attributes. A very active man may stand with the toe on his advanced foot almost touching the short service line. In this position, he makes it very difficult for the server to deliver a short service so accurate as to be reasonably safe. On the other hand, it is a mistake to stand so close up if one thereby makes it too much of an effort to get back quickly enough to deal properly, by which I mean severely, with a good lob. Nowadays, alas, I find it advisable to stand about a couple of feet further from the net than I did 10 years ago. This naturally lessens my chance of rushing a short service, but I should pay a heavier price in loss of power to smash a good lob by standing further forward. It is no use to concentrate on making a short service dangerous if one thereby leaves practically a safe opening for a lob, and each player must find out for himself how close in he can afford to stand without giving away too much in other directions. But, given the necessary activity, the further forward, the better. For somewhat similar reasons, the striker out should stand much nearer the center than the sideline. Otherwise, he permits the server to deliver, without much danger, a low driving service towards the junction of the center and long service lines. This service, if not intercepted early in its flight, is comparatively safe, lending itself to no very aggressive return, and in extreme cases, coming as near to being itself an aggressive stroke as is possible for a service, particularly when delivered from the right-hand court. But it is a very difficult and dangerous service against an opponent who stands near the center line, as he then has an excellent chance of intercepting it and making a winning smash. In a single, the striker out must necessarily adjust his position to allow for the extra depth of court he has to guard. Even so, a player of exceptional agility may find it worthwhile to stand close up to the short service line. H.N. Marret, for one, used to do so, but his activity was phenomenal, and I fancy very few would find the practice pay. About 4 or 5 feet behind the line is probably a good average position. At that distance from the net, there will be a few opportunities of actually rushing a short service. But that will not matter as much as it would in a double, as, in a single, there are so many ways of attacking in reply to such a service, providing one can get to the shuttlecock in time to take it fairly near the net. In time, that is, to allow oneself a considerable choice of reply, thus securing the initiative. Standing about 4 or 5 feet behind the line, one should be near enough for this purpose, while sufficiently far back to deal comfortably with a good length lob. Against an opponent who uses a short service very frequently, it may be a good thing to stand a little nearer now and then, so as to try and crump him. But almost all strong players rely mainly on the lob service in singles, a fact which must influence the striker out in his choice of position. When waiting to receive service, the striker out must, of course, pay due regard to the principles of poise and balance, and be properly on his toes so as to be ready for instantaneous movement. Most good players stand with the left foot forward, while some have the left foot advanced when in the right-hand court, and vice versa. I myself wait with the right foot advanced in either court, but I am one of a very small minority in this respect, and though I believe the practice has good points to set off against its defects, I do not recommend it. The usual method, left foot forward, is, I believe, theoretically correct. Important though it be to act as quickly as possible after the service has been delivered, the striker out must be careful not to commit himself before he has a clear realization of the exact path of the shuttlecock. Otherwise, flurried action and a possible mishit will result, instead of a well-controlled quickness and a clean stroke. Just as some chances are wasted through dilatoriness, so, on the other hand, many aces are lost through undue haste. This is especially true of ill-judged attempts to kill a short service, for a slapdash rush to the net without a proper sight of the shuttlecock will fail more often than not. Now and again it may be worthwhile to gamble on the chance of a short service being delivered, and to jump in before one has really had time to judge the flight of the shuttlecock with certainty, but very seldom. The risk is much greater than that attaching to similar anticipation in the course of a rally, in doubles anyhow, for then, if you do guess wrong, an alert partner may come to your rescue. In returning service, you have to trust entirely to your own efforts to extricate yourself from any predicament in which you are landed by premature movement. Moreover, the player who chances his arm in this way is very apt to start before the service has been delivered, which, apart from the danger, is of course a foul, and, though not likely to be penalized, the umpire's attention being probably fixed on the server, nonetheless to be avoided on that account. I have already expressed a very decided opinion that it is the duty of the server to make quite certain that his delivery is absolutely fair, and I regard it as equally incumbent on the striker out to be punctilious in his turn in observing the rule which requires him to stand until the service is delivered. This rule is, I am sure, broken much more frequently than most players realize, and in my opinion it is quite as serious a transgression as any breach of the rules relating to service. Subject to the foregoing, the striker out should do everything he can to treat the service with severity. If he makes the most of his chances and kills anything in the nature of a loose service, whether low or high, the moral effect is likely to be invaluable. The server will realize that he must place practically to an inch in order to avoid disaster, and in attempting to cut things as fine as possible, he may just overdo it and serve a fault. To shake your opponent's confidence in his service is usually a big step towards victory. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10 of The Art of Badminton by Sir George Thomas, Baronet. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. Feinting. The beginner has already been warned against premature attempts to develop the more tricky side of stroke production, and his first aim should certainly be to acquire thorough mastery over the shuttlecock by ordinary straightforward methods. Having accomplished that, however, he should proceed to cultivate the art of deception, learning how to suggest, by the preliminary action of a stroke, something different from his real intention. There is nothing in any other game quite like this clever feinting, which is such a conspicuous feature of good badminton, and a really finished player is capable of delivering a stroke in a highly deceptive manner. There is no special rule to be followed when developing this side of your game. The general principles of stroke production still hold good. In fact, the chief difficulty is to avoid violating any of those principles when introducing that last-moment change of action on which the attempted deception is based. For instance, when checking your swing so as to convert a simulated fast stroke into a drop shot, you must be careful to preserve that firm touch on which the accuracy of a drop shot so largely depends. However, if you have developed your strokes on sound lines, you are not likely to find any excessive difficulty of execution in this particular phase. Facility will come with practice. Success is largely a matter of accurate timing, and the decisive change of action must, of course, be introduced at the latest possible moment. The commonest of all feinting strokes is a drop shot played from the back of the court in place of a threatened smash, and it is not very difficult to make the pretense of smashing so realistic as to catch even the most alert opponent off his guard now and then. But it is curious that many players who execute this stroke really well make little or no attempt to cultivate the other form of deception as to pace, in which a fast travelling stroke is substituted for a suggested drop shot. This is perhaps a little more difficult, but, once mastered, it is fully as useful. In a single especially, a quick drive to the back of the court from the vicinity of the net, when the opponent has been led to expect a drop shot, is very likely to produce a good opening, or even to score outright. Deception should, of course, be practiced in regard to direction as well as pace. The attempt to deceive must necessarily be based on some visible action, that is to say, the idea you wish to convey as to your intentions must be suggested by something you actually do, by the pace at which you swing your racket, for example. In this, you must be careful to avoid exaggeration, aiming at making the deceptive movement just distinct enough and no more, to be observed by your opponent. Emphasize it too heavily, and you will at once arouse his suspicions, thus stultifying your object. Here, however, there is room for the occasional exercise of a deeper brand of guile, the pretense at pretense. Exaggerate your action a little, not too much, so as to convey the impression that you are feinting a trifle obviously, and then complete the stroke suggested by your action without alteration. This may surprise your opponent quite effectively if you have succeeded in leading him to anticipate a feint. However cleverly your feinting strokes may be executed, use them sparingly. In common with some of the more elaborate drop shots, these strokes exercise an undue fascination over many players, but they become almost entirely ineffective if used too often. For, to be of any real service, they must take the opponent by surprise, and an experienced player is so keenly on his guard against traps of any kind that it is very difficult indeed to catch him napping. Besides being careful not to use these strokes too often, you must avoid reserving them for more or less stereotyped situations. This is an error very easy to commit, for certain types of position seem naturally adapted to the purpose. But it is, of course, just in these positions that a clever opponent will be especially alert to guard against surprise, so you must strive after variety in this just as in every other phase of the game. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11 of The Art of Badminton by Sir George Thomas, Baronet. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11 Tactics, General Ideas. However complete may be your equipment of strokes, it will not carry you far unless you use it judiciously. Badminton, properly played, is a battle of wits as well as of executive skill and activity, and superior tactical ability frequently triumphs over more obvious advantages. This is one of the great charms of the game, and it calls into play so many and such varied qualities. Any attempt to lay down hard and fast rules in regard to tactics would be futile. Too much depends on the precise circumstances of the moment, which cannot be catalogued in detail. It is only possible to consider ideas and methods in a very general way. In this chapter I shall deal mainly with points equally applicable to all branches of the game, and though, for convenience, I shall refer to your opponent in the singular, the term must constantly be read as indicating either a pair or a single adversary. In subsequent chapters I shall deal separately with the special characteristics of singles and doubles. In shaping your tactics, you will have two main ideas constantly in view: to secure for yourself an opening for a winning stroke, and to deny a similar opportunity to your opponent. Unfortunately, these ideas are apt to clash, and attempt to put your adversary into difficulties, often entailing a corresponding risk to yourself, and you must then subordinate one or the other consideration. The choice is sometimes very difficult, and one of the hallmarks of a good tactician is his instinctive realization as to when a risk is worth taking. Much depends on the personal factor, of course, and there is a very marked difference to be observed in the methods of various experts. Some have a natural inclination towards safety tactics, others are at their best when forcing the pace of the rallies. There can be no actual right or wrong in this connection, and just as I believe the individual should develop his strokes in the way that comes naturally to him, subject of course to the elimination of any radical fault, so I think he should develop his tactics along the lines suited to his strokes, his temperament, and his physical qualities, remembering, however, that either caution or enterprise may easily be carried to excess. My personal preference is always for an attacking game. The most elementary tactical principle is the obvious one that a player is more favorably placed if in a position to hit downwards than if compelled to hit upwards. From this it follows that you should take the shuttlecock well above the level of the net, overhead for choice, whenever you can, and this applies to situations in which safety is your main consideration, as well as to those in which you have a possible opening for attack. For example, when clearing in reply to a good length lob, you can hit overhead to the far base line with much less effort than would be required to make an underhand shot travel the same distance. Getting to the shuttlecock in time to hit it overhead may, of course, be something of an effort in itself, an effort which you might save yourself if content to play your shot underhand. But you will find it is generally false economy to spare yourself while getting into position, if you thereby let yourself in for a more difficult or tiring stroke. Within common sense limits, be it understood. There is no point in making a violent effort to take the shuttlecock overhead unless you materially improve your position thereby. Nor is it worth trying an overhead shot if you are too hurried to control it properly. In such a case, it is far better to take your time and play a more deliberate stroke from a lower level. Although it is an advantage to be in a position to hit downwards, it by no means follows that a downward stroke is always best. When really far back in court, the chance of scoring outright, with either a smash or a drop, may be so slight as to be scarcely worth the attempt, and either of those strokes, if played, may give an opening for a quick low return transferring the attack to the opponent. Everything depends on the relative position of the players at the moment, but in certain cases a good length overhead lob is more likely to retain the initiative than any other stroke, especially if containing an element of unexpectedness. This idea of trying to give your opponent the shot he does not expect is, of course, one of the essentials of good placing, and you should be careful not to fall into stereotype methods, either in attack or in defense. Take, for example, the gentle art of running an opponent about. The unthoughtful player has here only one object, to place the shuttlecock as far as possible from the last spot to which he sent it. His opponent, quickly tumbling to the fixity of this idea, knows just what is coming, finds he need never fear a trap, and is probably well on the way to the attacked spot before the shuttlecock starts for it. With the result that, though having perhaps a long way to go, he covers the distance without difficulty, possibly making the striker feel a little aggrieved that so well placed a stroke should produce so little effect. The clever player, on the other hand, never forgets that it is a far greater effort to turn when on the move and take one step in an awkward direction, than to move a comparatively long way in a straight line. Therefore, though he may actually play the obvious shot 5 times out of 6, he is always threatening to put the shuttlecock back to the spot it has come from, or to some other point, forcing on the opponent, if he be moving, an awkward change of direction. With this threat constantly hanging over him, the opponent dare not rush helter-skelter for the most distant part of the court. He must control his balance so as to be able to turn back easily if necessary. Consequently, that most distant spot becomes, in effect, a great deal further off, and a shot placed there is much more likely to score, or to lead up to a chance of scoring, than if it could have been anticipated with certainty and safety. This is just an elementary example. The intricacies of clever placing are much too subtle, and depend too much on ever-changing details to be capable of minute description. While seeking to hide your own intentions to the last possible moment, you must continually try to divine those of your adversary. Always remembering, however, that ill-regulated efforts at anticipation will lead you into many a pitfall. Judicious anticipation, as practiced by a player well versed in the less obvious phases of the game, is one of the most valuable elements of courtcraft, perhaps the most valuable of all. As an attacking weapon, it makes the most of chances so slight that, if not foreseen, they could not be turned to advantage. In defense, it saves many an apparently hopeless situation. Haphazard anticipation, on the other hand, costs far more than it is worth. Such dangers as lurk in the exercise of this faculty only threaten, however, when you proceed from thought to action. The first stage is wholly mental, and to that extent, the more you practice anticipation, the better. Always try to have a definite idea as to what your opponent is likely to do next, both in relation to his strokes and to his movements about the court. Even if you think it inadvisable to commit yourself to any counter-movement before he actually does what you expect, the mere fact that you are expecting it will give you a much better chance of dealing with it successfully should your anticipation prove correct. The danger, of course, becomes a live factor whenever circumstances induce you to start your counter-movement in advance of the actual happening it is designed to meet. Then, naturally, should your anticipation prove incorrect, You run the risk of being caught on the wrong foot, a risk justified by circumstances perhaps, but very real for all that. This risk is most acute when your anticipatory movement exactly coincides in point of time with your opponent's stroke. You can often avoid this by starting early, getting far enough for your purpose before your opponent strikes, and holding yourself in check, so to speak, at the precise moment when he does so. Then, should he play some stroke other than the one you anticipated, you will not be left standing. This sort of restrained anticipation is extraordinarily useful as a means of keeping good general position, closing up gaps, cramping your opponent's freedom of action, and so forth. But it is not the sort of anticipation that seizes on and scores off barely recognizable chances. It is generally pretty obvious, giving your adversary time to adjust his stroke to your change of position. And it is seldom indeed that a good player is so badly fixed as to be tied down to one particular stroke. The later you act, the greater your chance of catching your opponent off his guard and bringing off a surprise. But you cannot have it both ways. The more closely you time your action, the more likely it is to be decisive if you have guessed right. But the more likelihood of trouble for yourself if you have guessed wrong. The danger attaching to what may be called speculative anticipation is obviously far greater in a single than in a double, as an alert partner can do so much to stave off unpleasant consequences should the attempt prove abortive. Some players have a positive gift for sensing likely openings, and if allowed a more or less free hand, will snap up plenty of chances which would otherwise go begging. Given a good understanding with his partner, it pays well for a player of this type to gamble in moderation on his intuition, and the partner must be really good at covering him, otherwise the speculations will probably throw away more aces than they bring in. In a single, really daring anticipation is hardly ever worthwhile, for your opponent must be in a very tight corner indeed before you can be sure of his next move. What I have referred to as restrained anticipation, that is, getting as near as one can to the desired position, while retaining the ability to move in any direction, is, however, even more valuable in singles than in doubles. One very important point in regard to anticipation is that you should time your movement according to whether your opponent usually plays his stroke early or late. This is one of the details in which players vary to a surprising degree, and anticipation against anyone who habitually delays his stroke should be itself delayed. Otherwise, he will have ample time to alter his stroke, if necessary, after observing the anticipatory movement. This, by the way, opens up interesting possibilities of counter-finesse. The player who usually takes his strokes early can sometimes fox his opponent by waiting a trifle longer than usual, and vice versa. Many otherwise ingenious players seem hardly to appreciate how much can be done by anticipating the movements as well as the strokes of an opponent. This is, in effect, anticipating anticipation, but is not nearly such a cumbersome process as it sounds. If you bear in mind that your adversary is just as keen on forestalling your strokes as you are on forestalling his, you will see at once that his movements depend to a great extent on his estimate of what is likely to be your next stroke. Therefore, if you can engineer a position in which the probability of your playing a certain stroke is sufficiently great, you may induce him to gamble on it, thus leaving you an effective opening for something quite different. As a definite example, suppose you have worked your opponent sufficiently out of position to leave some part of his court comparatively but not hopelessly exposed. There is a strong probability that he will feel compelled, at almost any cost, to get into position to defend that particular spot. If you aim at that spot, you may find that he has got back just in time to guard it and extricate himself from difficulty. Whereas, if you had guessed that in his efforts to cover the obvious point of danger he would leave a hole somewhere else, you might have finished the rally with a perfectly simple stroke to this new target. Here, however, as in every phase of tactics, you must be prepared to find finesse countering your own. Your opponent may carry the process of stage further, anticipating your anticipation of his action, and, correctly divining that you will refrain from attacking the obvious spot, which you expect him to defend at all costs, himself refrain from concentrating on its defense. so that when hoping to catch him on the wrong foot, you put the shuttlecock back to the spot from which he should, in theory, be moving precipitately, you find he has not compromised himself in that direction at all. You have, in fact, been outguessed, but that is merely one of the little incidents that add so much to the fascination of the game. With experience, you will develop a sense of position very helpful in guiding you as to the most favorable point to occupy in any particular set of circumstances. This is closely connected with anticipation, but it is not quite the same thing. It applies rather to ordinary situations, when you have nothing particular to anticipate, but desire to be in the best position for general purposes of attack or defense. Roughly speaking, this will normally be somewhere near the center of the zone you have to guard, that is to say, of the whole court in a single, or of your section in a double. But it will not always be the true center, and will shift according to the direction from which your opponent is striking. When he is some distance from the net, the shots with which you will have the least time to deal are those he hits hard. Now, wherever he may be, there will be a more or less limited angle within which he must keep any fast-moving shot, or it would otherwise fall outside the court. Your aim should be so to post yourself in regard to that angle that you may have an equally good chance of reaching the furthest possible fast-traveling shot on either wing. When your opponent is opposite the center of your court, or section of court, you will best cover the dangerous angle by facing him almost exactly, while, as his position shifts to one side or the other, yours should correspond, but in much less degree. Thus, if he be practically on a side line, you should edge a little towards that side line, but only enough to give it adequate protection. By keeping too directly opposite your opponent, that is, too near the side line, part of the zone within your reach would be outside the court. Clear waste of defensive power. Remember, in this connection, that you have an appreciable bigger reach on the backhand than on the forehand, for defensive purposes anyhow, so you should guard your forehand line a shade more closely than the other. The nearer your opponent is to the net, the less time you will have for reaching a drop shot, a factor which must be taken into account in adjusting your own distance from the net. You can always advance, however, more quickly than you can retire, so that when your main object is merely to be near enough to be sure of reaching any drop shot that may come, you need not be at all close up. When attacking, however, it is often useful to approach more closely, so as to be near enough to jump on a drop shot, thereby cramping your opponent's choice of a reasonably safe stroke. In choosing your base, you must also bear in mind any specially effective strokes your opponent may command. His cross-court smash, for example, may generally travel faster than that straight down a line, and in such a case you will naturally keep a little further across than you otherwise would. From all this you will realize that there are a number of points to be harmonized in deciding on your best position at any given moment, and it is only when your grasp of the various factors becomes instinctive that you will acquire the sense of position to which I have referred. But you can greatly assist its development by proper realization of the diverse considerations on which it must be based. Before leaving this question, I want to emphasize the advice already given in the chapter on footwork. While needing a clear idea as to where you would like to be when waiting for your opponent's stroke, you can easily sacrifice too much in your efforts to get to that precise spot. If you have been forced right away from it, you will do better to come only part of the way back, checking your movement so as to have the power to turn in any direction, than to reach the desired spot with an effort that leaves you off your balance and unable to turn, if necessary, just when your opponent strikes. In choosing the best stroke to play at any particular moment, you will, of course, be influenced by the personality of your opponent. You will naturally aim at exploiting any weakness in his game, and at giving him as few opportunities as you can to use any specially effective stroke he may possess. These two ideas are so obvious as to need no elucidation. What is not so obvious is the danger of carrying either of them too far. Nevertheless, that danger exists. It is seldom worthwhile to play a really difficult shot instead of an easy one, with the sole idea of denying your opponent an opening for some favorite stroke. Such play will, more often than not, land you in worse trouble than that you are seeking to avoid, and the general effect on your tactics will be very cramping. Positions constantly arise in which the soundest plan is to stand up boldly to your opponent's best shot and, if possible, attack it. An idea about which I shall have more to say elsewhere. Similarly, many aces are thrown away by misplaced attempts to press an attack home at some particular, and at the moment unnatural angle. This means that an entirely unnecessary element of risk is introduced, with disastrous results. Very difficult strokes in general should be reserved for desperate occasions. By difficult strokes I mean here those which have to be turned at very awkward angles, and the more elaborate species of trick shot. In short, those in which there is a pronounced element of danger for even the most skillful executant. I do not include any shot, whether straightforward or of a trick nature, if the striker should be reasonably sure of bringing it off successfully. Badminton is a game in which a good player can be extraordinarily accurate in the performance of quite difficult strokes, and these he should use freely and confidently up to the limit of his capability. But directly the difficulty becomes so pronounced as to make a reasonable degree of certainty impossible, then that particular stroke is not worth playing except as a forlorn hope in a serious predicament. Experts frequently do, in moments of extreme necessity, save themselves by really astounding spectacular efforts, but few of them attempt such shots unless in dire trouble. Really difficult strokes are, however, undeniably fascinating, and if you have a leaning that way, you should watch yourself carefully and curb any tendency to over-spectacular methods. They never pay in the long run, however brilliant the performer. Throughout a rally, aim at some definite purpose with every shot. If there is nothing special to be done with the stroke itself, try to make it lead up to something favorable. I have already indicated that my personal preference is all for forcing tactics. When I am not actually attacking, my aim, except in very special circumstances, is to find some means of securing the attack. Even when definitely on the defensive, I am always looking for a chance to turn defense into attack. That, however, is largely a matter of style and temperament, and I do not want to lay too much stress on my individual preferences, which are, I know, opposed to the methods of some of the soundest tacticians. Many first-class players rely a great deal on waiting tactics. But even here, there is a definite purpose to be served all the time. The design may be to lure the opponent into some indiscretion, or even merely to wear him down by a stonewalling process. But in either case, the player is, or should be, working systematically for a definite end. Accurate lobs, judiciously interspersed with drop shots, but not too many of these, form the basis of waiting tactics. Habitual exponents of this system obviously need to be very strong in defense. So long as they avoid giving a chance for a short kill, they do not in the least mind being smashed at. In fact, they rather play for it as a means of exhausting an opponent who throws all his energies into persistent attack. Nothing is more wearing than to keep on smashing good-length lobs against a stone-wall defense. Naturally, the lobs must be of very good length, and an opponent with a really good smash may kill even a perfect lob. But it is very difficult indeed to score outright from the back of the court, and the player with a thoroughly sound defense relies on being able to pick up almost any smash, providing his lob has been a good one. This applies particularly to doubles. In a single, with the full width of the court to guard, the danger is, of course, greater. But even in a single, an active player who keeps a good length can do some surprising work in the way of retrieving smashes, while it is easier for him to place his lob so that his opponent has difficulty in making an effective attacking stroke. The direction of the lob, apart from its actual length, is, of course, highly important in all branches of the game, the object being to place it so as to make the opponent expend the maximum effort in getting into position. Even the most persistent stonewaller must be prepared to attack when the proper moment arrives, either when some good opening crops up in the course of a rally, or when the wearing down process has broken the back of his adversary's attack. Then he must take up the pressure in his turn. Otherwise, his opponent can simply take a breather, playing a non-committal game himself while restoring his energy, and the main effect of the stonewalling tactics will be wasted. for the very attacking player is seldom at his best in defense, and when he has been knocked off his usual game, he should be assailed vigorously. Turn now to attacking methods. There is, I think, more scope for artistry in maneuvering for a good opening than in any other phase of the game. The actual decisive stroke mainly depends, more often than not, on force, but there are several other types of opening to be angled for besides the chance of a kill. You may, for example, work your opponent so far out of position that you can score with a placed shot of no particular pace. You may catch him on the wrong foot, or trick him in a variety of ways. You may even beat him with a drop shot so perfect that he fails to return it, though well able to reach it. But while this is to me the most fascinating side of badminton, I must confess that I find it quite impossible to indicate any special principles for your guidance when striving for a position likely to lead to a winning opening. Everything depends on the exact relative positions of yourself and your opponent. Useful advice can, apparently, only start at the point where you are definitely on the attack, and even then can be no more than generalization. In the main, the smash is, undoubtedly, the strongest attacking stroke, though a well-judged drop shot may, at the right moment, be even more effective. As an actual winner, the drop shot almost invariably depends for its success on the element of surprise, except against an opponent who is very badly out of position, and for that reason you should usually smash for preference, if you feel you have a reasonable chance of killing outright. But that is only a rough guide, for there are occasions, even when you are quite near the net, when the drop shot is the more likely winner of the two. The further you are from the net, the less likely you are to score outright with a smash, and the more useful is the drop as an alternative. While, as an additional variant, a lob over the head of an opponent standing well forward may be a most useful attacking stroke, though only, as a rule, when there is no opening for anything more forcible. In general, when you have secured the attack, you should press it as hard as you can, not necessarily for continuous smashing, but every stroke should be designed to give your opponent real trouble. At times, however, if you find the impression you are making on the defense is not commensurate with the energy you are expending, it becomes necessary to use greater restraint. By wasting your energy in trying to batter down a defense that is successfully keeping you at bay, you simply play into the stonewaller's hands. In such a case, it is far better to take things quietly and refuse to be lured into unproductive exertion. Then, if the stonewaller, thinking your attack has worn itself out, seeks to take the initiative himself, you will have sufficient stuffing left in you to foil his counterattack. Let me conclude this chapter by urging, as emphatically as I can, the supreme importance of variety. Variety in every phase of tactics, in the minor details as well as in the broad outlines. Try to keep your opponent guessing all the time. There are all sorts of ways in which variety can be introduced. It may even, paradoxically, take the form of a series of identical strokes. If you have been keeping your opponent well on the run and mixing your strokes very freely, you may quite possibly surprise him by sending 3 or more consecutively to the same spot. Even the pace of your smashes may be varied with advantage, and one somewhat slower than usual, though theoretically easier to return, may be mistimed by your opponent. In every direction, aim at variety, variety, always variety. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12 of The Art of Badminton by Sir George Thomas Barbanet. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. Doubles, Side-by-Side Formation. There are 2 distinct systems of combination in doubles. One, the more usual, in which each partner takes roughly half the court, the dividing line being down the center. The other, known commonly as the back and front, sometimes as the pivot formation, in which one player guards the whole width of the net, while the partner takes charge of the back of the court. In between these 2 systems come modifications of each, in which the partners rely mainly on one formation, but switch to the other in certain circumstances. But a fairly definite line can be drawn between the 2 systems, and in this chapter I shall deal with that in which the partners usually keep alongside each other. This is the formation adopted almost invariably in men's doubles, and by the majority of strong pairs in ladies' doubles, though as far as the latter branch of the game is concerned, there are some very notable exceptions. It is the natural formation for any pair consisting of two fairly level players, level in point of activity and strength, as well as skill. The first essential of side-by-side combination is that it must not be too rigid. For each player to stick religiously to his own half of the court, irrespective of his partner's position, would be absurd. Their zones of actions will constantly be shifting, and the dividing line will often run obliquely across the court instead of down the middle. For instance, when one has been drawn close to the net, his partner must be prepared to cover him at the back of the court, and the forward player must, in turn, limit his partner's liability by covering perhaps the whole region near the net. Such situations should, however, be only temporary, the players reverting to their normal positions as soon as the particular reason which necessitated the alteration no longer exists. Partners who cover each other intelligently in this sort of way can save each other much hard work and many difficulties. In this connection, a thorough knowledge of your partner's tastes is invaluable. Almost every player has individual ideas as to exactly when he likes to be covered, or when he prefers to get back to his normal position. If you thoroughly understand his preferences, combination will be comparatively easy. Ignorance of them will lead to constant clashing and, even worse, to holes guarded by neither your partner nor yourself. A regular pair, well together, scores heavily and may easily beat two individually stronger players who do not suit each other. Therefore, I strongly advise anyone who is keen on match play to get a regular partner, if possible, someone of about his own standard and, this is highly important, congenial. Partners out of sympathy with each other will never do themselves justice. One of the most useful qualities for purposes of combination is that of knowing when to chip in order to kill a weak return. A good stroke from the back of the court by your partner will often produce a momentary opening in front of him, so fleeting that he will not be able to get forward quickly enough to make use of it himself, but offering you, if sufficiently quick to take advantage of it, a chance to finish the rally. Some players have a positive gift for sensing when such an opening is likely to arise. It is a tremendous asset, and you should do your best to cultivate it. A word of warning, however, don't overdo it. Indiscriminate poaching is the reverse of helpful. Although partners adopting the normal formation have, in the main, similar functions, they should adjust their combination so as to allow each the fullest possible scope for any special talent he may happen to possess. For instance, one of the two may have a particularly severe kill. He should then take a good deal more than his strict share of overhead shots. The other, perhaps, may be stronger in defense or quicker on his feet, and he should cover more than his half of the court in defensive work or in rushing tactics. There are any number of directions in which your partner may have special ability, and it is up to you to give him every chance of making the best use of it. In doing that, you must not be content merely to leave him the shots that suit him. You must also be careful to back him up by covering any spot, normally in his share of the court, which he may momentarily leave unguarded. This principle must, of course, be applied mutually. In order to realize how you and your partner can best fit in with each other, it is most important for you to have a just estimate of your own play, its flaws and good points alike. Unless you admit frankly to yourself that he is better than you in some particular direction, you will take many strokes that you might more profitably leave to him, and vice versa, of course. Remember that it is much easier for you to say to your partner, "You kill better than I do, I think you had better take most of the high shots down the middle," than for him to point out the fact to you. But there is a great deal more in the art of combination than knowing what to leave to your partner and how to back him up. In the actual playing of your strokes, you must keep in mind his likes and dislikes, as well as your own. Try to avoid exposing him to any particular form of attack that bothers him, even though it may have no terrors for you, and try to control the rally in such a way as to offer him the type of opening he prefers. Some players seem to have great difficulty in realizing the importance of this. They continually work for their own hand only, forgetting that in a double, selfishness is the supreme folly. From this necessity of adapting your tactics to suit your partner as well as yourself, it might be thought that you would do best to pair with a player as closely akin to yourself in style as possible. But that does not follow at all. Some of the most effective pairs have consisted of players widely separated in type. The principle of playing to your partner goes deeper than consideration of his good and bad strokes. You are equally concerned with his temperament, which is likely to differ from your own in quite as marked a degree as his strokes. This will reflect itself in his methods, frequently in ways which do not coincide with your own ideas, but which are so much part and parcel of himself as to be quite beyond your influence, even though you may normally be the controlling partner. Some players are so constituted that they cannot help trying their most risky strokes at a crisis. Others, at such a moment, seem to retire into a shell and abandon all attempts to attack. There are in fact countless little ways in which temperamental peculiarities will out, and it is no use to let them worry you. Remember that you, too, have your little weaknesses, which are doubtless quite as expensive, and turn your whole attention to counteracting your partner's indiscretion, or lack of nerve, or whatever his fault may be, as best you can without bothering him. As in other branches of the game, I pin my faith to attacking methods, and for a pair using the ordinary formation, even more than for one adopting the back and front system, the smash should be the staple attacking stroke. A notable object lesson in the value of consistent severity was furnished by J.F. Devlin and G.A. Sauter when winning the doubles championship in 1922. It is scarcely an exaggeration to say that whenever either of them took the shuttlecock above the level of the net, he hit it hard, and a more deadly form of attack I have never encountered. I do not mean that you should go all out for a kill every time. That would be waste of energy against a strong defensive pair. But a judiciously restrained smash, sufficiently severe to preserve the attack without overpressing it, is almost always sound. That when you have no actual opening. When you have a possible chance to score outright, go for it without reserve. When attacking, it is often a good plan to make a dead set at one or other of your opponents. Where there is any marked difference in ability, the one with a weaker defense will naturally be your usual target. But even when no such difference exists, this plan frequently yields good results. Again, after hammering at one player for some time, it often pays to switch suddenly on to his partner, even though the latter be actually the stronger of the two, for it is always more difficult to make a good stroke after a period of inactivity than when one has been taking the chief part in a rally. This applies in attack as well as in defense. For which reason it is sometimes advisable for a player who, by smashing several consecutive strokes, has finally forced a definite opening, to follow up and play the kill himself, even though it be actually in his partner's court, but only when the swing of his smash has drawn him naturally in that direction. This is, of course, the direct opposite to the chipping in idea already mentioned, and a clear understanding between the partners as to which of these methods is to be used in certain typical situations is one of the essentials of good combination. While, for a side-by-side pair, force rather than finesse is the chief factor in attack, there is ample scope for clever headwork in the process of maneuvering for an attacking position. Here, well-chosen drop shots are invaluable, and it usually pays for one partner to follow a really close drop shot to the net so as to make another drop shot in return as dangerous as possible, thus perhaps forcing the opposition to clear to the player who has remained back. Should the opponent, in preference to clearing, join in an interchange of close work at the net, the advantage of position will lie, more often than not, with the player who has opened the duel, assuming his initial drop shot to have been really good. Turning to defense, the main essentials are to keep an accurate length when clearing and to skim the net closely with other strokes. Some pairs rely almost entirely on lobbing, and this is perhaps the hardest form of defense to break through, providing the defending players have great, by which I mean exceptional, power in returning smashes. The present double champions, GBS Mack and J.F. Devlin, are a case in point. Even when angling for an opening without being actually on the defensive, they make far more use of lobs than of drop shots or drives. But they each possess an unusual capacity for returning smashes, and in combination they put in some amazing work in this line. The average pair would probably be better advised to invest their defensive methods with as much variety as possible, so that any weakness in return may be minimized by the possibility of its not having been expected. When taking a smash from one opponent, always keep in view the chance of his partner trying to chip in on your return. When you think he means to do so, you can frequently turn an awkward situation into a favorable one by a quick drive to the spot from which he is moving. Timed just right, such a stroke may quite possibly catch both opponents off their guard and, even if not scoring outright, transfer the attack to your own hands. Ordinary side-by-side methods are not so suitable for mixed as for men's or ladies' doubles, because, in a pair well matched as far as the standard of skill is concerned, the man will normally have the greater power of stroke and physical advantages, qualities which will be wasted to some extent if he and his partner take an equal share of the work, particularly at the back of the court. On the other hand, not all first-class women players are willing or suited to fill the role of the net player in strict back-and-front tactics. Nor, incidentally, though the exceptions are not so numerous, is every first-class man fitted to take all the play at the back. The result is that some very strong mixed double pairs adopt a sort of halfway method. Given suitable exponents, this is very effective, but to exploit it successfully, the woman must be an all-round player of the highest class, equally good in attack and in defense. The general basis of this system is that the partners play mainly alongside of each other, especially when defending. But when a suitable opening for attack presents itself, the man falls back so as to secure the bulk of the smashing, and his partner advances to the net. That is only a bald summary, but it is almost impossible to be more explicit, especially as the various pairs who practice this kind of game differ a good deal in the details of its execution, particularly as regards the extent to which back and front methods should be incorporated. End of Chapter 12. Chapter 13 of The Art of Badminton by Sir George Thomas Baronet. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. Doubles, Back and Front Formation. The back and front formation is, as its name suggests, that in which one player takes practically all strokes in the vicinity of the net, while the partner covers all the back portion of the court. From its nature, it is specially suitable for mixed doubles. It is true that a few of the strongest pairs in ladies' doubles adopt it, and very successfully too. The present champions, Mrs. Racket and Miss Hogarth, are a notable example. But such pairs are the exceptions rather than the rule, and the successes they achieve are due to the players concerned having a particular bent in this direction, rather than to any inherent advantage in the system from the point of view of ladies' doubles. In men's doubles, back and front tactics are hardly ever, one might really say never, employed by a pair of about equal ability. It is a different matter when there is a marked disparity in skill between the partners. Then, either in men's or in ladies' doubles, it is usually best for the weaker player to go to the net, leaving the stronger to do the bulk of the work, for only in this way can it be made difficult or dangerous for the opponents to hammer on the weak spot. Used in such cases, however, the formation is merely a means of eliminating the weak player as far as possible. An idea essentially different from that underlying the true methods of good back and front combination, in which the net player's duties are of the utmost importance and call for skill of a very high order. Anyway, it is in mixed doubles that this formation is most commonly employed, and its effectiveness in that branch of the game has been proved up to the hilt. Naturally, it suits some players better than others, and not all the cracks favor it. But without wallowing in statistics, it is probably not too much to claim that it wins more often than not. This in spite of the brilliantly earned victory of GSB Mac and Mrs. Racket, who are not a back and front pair, at the last All England Championships. The respective zones of action of a pair pursuing strict back and front tactics are more clearly defined than in the case of an ordinary double, and once the partners have taken up their chosen formation, they should not allow themselves to be lured from it, save under pressure of quite exceptional circumstances. Obviously, however, they cannot start every rally in the position they desire. In fact, it is only when the net player is serving that they can do so. Then, with the server somewhere near the junction of the short service and central lines, and her partner more or less directly behind her, they are already virtually in position. Naturally, they cannot start like this when the man is serving. I am assuming a mixed pair in action, with the lady, of course, doing the network, as he would be most unsuitably placed for the purpose. They open the rally in more favorable circumstances, therefore, and consequently with slightly better chances of scoring an ace, when the net player serves than when her partner does so. And for that reason, to avoid wasting the superior chance, such as it is particularly important for her to possess a sound and consistent service. She should rely chiefly on a low service, but must, of course, vary it sufficiently to keep her opponents guessing. When the man serves, it is rather a question whether his partner should make for the net at once, or whether she should wait for the first return before going forward. J.F. Devlin, an exceptionally brilliant exponent of this type of game, likes his partner to go up at once, relying on being able to get into position himself in time to deal with whatever return may fall to his lot at the back of the court. So did those other great back-of-the-court players, H.N. Marrett and G.A. Sauter. But each of these has, or had, an uncanny faculty for retrieving smashes which would defeat almost anyone else. Personally, not being so blessed, I prefer my partners to wait for the first return before advancing to the net. This seems to allow me a wider choice as to the position from which I serve and the type of service I deliver. If I serve a lob, I reckon that my partner and I have, between us, a better chance of taking a well-placed answering smash than I should have if attempting to guard the full width of the court myself. And this defensive extra is worth more to me than immediate securing of the proper back and front position, even though I must be prepared, in consequence, to deal with certain drop shots in what would normally be my partner's zone. It is a question that individual players must settle for themselves, though I fancy the average man, with only the average capacity for retrieving smashes, will do better if his partner postpones taking up her position at the net until his service has been returned. Of course, the return may be one which allows the back and front formation to be assumed at once without difficulty, and in hardly any case should delay in getting into that formation be carried further than to the extent of waiting for the actual return of service. Even if the next stroke by the server or his partner should be a lob, there will be the full length of the court to play into, and therefore much less danger than in the case of a lob service of a winning smash in reply, and a man of average activity should have at least a reasonable chance of picking up any smash that comes. Still, lobbing should be avoided, if possible, during the process of establishing the back and front position. Similarly, when the man is being served to, I think his partner should hang back until it is obvious that, in dealing with the service, he has not been drawn to the net. In this way, she will leave him free to try whatever stroke he pleases, should he wish, for instance, to rush a low service, without being hampered by the fear of leaving the back of the court too open should he fail to score. But again, the delay in taking up the back and front position should not extend beyond the first return. And even to that extent I think my ideas are at variance with those of a good many experts. When the net player is served to, she should always follow up her return at once, whether taking a high or a low service. Once the net player has taken up her proper position, one of her main difficulties will be to decide when to chip in on shots, which, though just within her reach, should pass beyond her if not intercepted. These shots will mostly be travelling fairly fast, giving her only the barest fraction of a second for making up her mind, and while by choosing the right occasion she may do most valuable work, by choosing the wrong she may easily throw away the rally. Probably the soundest advice is, if in any doubt, leave it. The shot is usually one which, if allowed to pass, can be dealt with fairly easily by the man, and it may even give him an opening for an effective kill. On the other hand, clever interception, especially if taking the opposition unawares, frequently wins a point outright. It is a most difficult but constantly recurring problem for the net player, and perhaps the nearest one can get to laying down a principle for her guidance in this, that she should not intercept a stroke for which she has to reach backwards, overhead, or towards either side. When she does act, it is imperative for her to act with decision. Hesitancy, whether in the form of half starting for the shot and then leaving it, or of taking it after giving her partner the impression that she is leaving it, almost always results in the back player being thrown completely out of position. An important point to remember is that the man, who has to bear the brunt of the defense, can more easily anticipate his opponent's next move when he plays the shot himself than when his partner does so, and for that reason it is better for the net player to take too little rather than too much. Though judicious chipping in, as practiced by Miss Hogarth, for example, is a very effective weapon. The stroke played in such a case should almost always be a drop, assuming, as is typical, that the shot intercepted is travelling fairly fast, and only just coming within reach of the net player. The position seldom lends itself to any attempt at a kill, whereas the effectiveness of a drop shot may be greatly increased by the quickness of the whole operation. Whenever possible, the net player's aim must of course be to hit downwards, but the chances of killing which come her way will generally be more suitable for a snapshot than for a full smash, as she will usually have to take them so close to the tape as to leave no room for a free hit. She must depend then on a flick of the wrist, and the more sharply she can bring the shuttlecock down in this way, either fore or backhanded, the more deadly will be the effect. When not in position to snap the shuttlecock down, she should usually keep it as low as possible, and the drop shot will generally be best for her purpose. But a low drive to the base line will often be useful if the shuttlecock, when she hits it, is not much below the level of the tape. A great deal naturally depends on the position of her opponents, and though I am strongly of opinion that she should lob very seldom, there are rare occasions when a lob is her safest resource. The normal waiting position of the net player should be opposite the center of the net, and no further back than the short service line. On occasion, however, when her partner plays certain shots from the side of the court, she can usually edge over a little, but not much, to the opposite side, so as to be able to intercept a fast return in that direction. Otherwise, such a return, just out of her reach in her normal position, may come back so quickly as to cause her partner grave trouble. As a case in point, it often happens that the back player, in trying for a winning smash from near a sideline, takes a considerable risk, if failing to score outright, of leaving a possible opening on the far side of the court for a quick return. By edging across slightly, the net player may just protect this potential weak spot and so eliminate or at least reduce the risk. Similarly, when the back player lobs from near the sideline, I think his partner should pay special attention to guarding the opposite wing. Of course, this is one of those details in which a pair who work well together get to know just how to act, and it gives the man much greater freedom of action in the direction of trying for possible but dangerous winning strokes, if he can rely on his partner to minimize the attendant risk by covering a potentially vulnerable spot. Every movement of the net player must be performed with the greatest celerity, and it is important for her to hold her racket, when not actually playing a stroke, in such a way as to be able to bring it into action practically instantaneously. Roughly speaking, she never has time to swing at a shot. She must shoot her racket straight into position and then develop any force required by means of wrist action or a push. This she will do best by holding her racket, when waiting, slightly in front of herself, and with its head above the level of her wrist. Inexperienced net players commonly make the mistake of holding the racket too low down and perhaps on one side, when not actually striking. As a result, it takes them just a fraction of a second longer to bring it into position, which makes all the difference when extreme quickness is required. For handling the racket in this way, the most suitable grip is that shown in Plate 4, as can be easily proved by experiment. That grip, however, is not so good as the normal, Plate 1, for other purposes. And I think anyone who means to specialize in net play should get in the habit of using both grips, the normal when anywhere towards the back of the court, the other when close up. There should be no difficulty in changing from one to the other when advancing to the net. Another important detail for the net player is to be careful not to obstruct her partner's view. In fact, when not actually playing a stroke, she should bend sufficiently to bring her head below the level of the net. When her opponent's lob, she will do well to turn her head and watch the shuttlecock after it has passed her. In this way she will know at once the direction of her partner's return, while if a good judge of distance, she may help him by calling if the lob would fall out. The tactics of a man in a back and front combination must depend to a great extent on his individual style. Personally, I like to play a forcing game because I am always much happier when attacking than when being attacked, and apart from personal peculiarities, I feel sure it must be a good thing to hold the initiative whenever possible. Attack then is my advice, but attack with restraint. I know that in this branch of the game I often fall into the mistake of smashing too much and dropping too little, wasting energy by pounding against a perhaps almost impenetrable defense. It is a judicious mixture of varied attacking strokes that yields the best results. Much depends on the formation adopted by the opponents. Against a side-by-side pair, the man can usually afford to play a quieter game than against another back-and-front combination. Less risk attaches to his drop shots, and he can often clear to the opposing lady with less danger than if putting the shuttlecock up to a man. When two back and front pairs are in opposition, there will constantly recur a particular type of rally in which the two men play backwards and forwards to each other down one sideline, half-court shots just out of range of the net players, but too low for either man to smash. This often goes on until one man thinks he has an opening for an effective drive, or low lob, across the court, deep into the far corner. Chosen at the right moment and accurately placed, this cross-court stroke is very telling, but it is one of the most dangerous shots in the game. The smallest error in execution will enable the opposing man to intercept it and probably score outright. Still, in spite of its risk, it is the best possible stroke at a suitable moment, and its judicious use is of great tactical value. In practicing it, you must learn to judge just how far you need to draw your opponent out of position in order to play this shot with success. In match play, you had better avoid it unless you are very confident that you have a suitable opening. The half-court shot down the line is, of course, extensively used by pairs playing sides against back and front. Accurately placed, it is a very safe shot, and has the merit of drawing the opposing man well away from his base. Obviously, he should not here reply with a similar stroke, as he might do against another back and front pair. His safest return will usually be a straight drop shot, but he must be alert to vary this against an opponent sufficiently close up to threaten a rush, either by clearing straight down the line, or by turning his drop shot across the court. Although every stroke which would fall short of the short service line normally belongs to his partner, the man must be prepared to dash in on occasion and help her out of a difficulty. However clever she may be in guarding her special zone, occasions are bound to arise when she is tucked up near one net post without a chance of getting across to a drop in the opposite corner. An alert and active partner can often come to the rescue in such a situation, but whenever drawn away from his base, he must get back to it as quickly as he can, for one of the chief objects of his opponents will be to throw the back and front combination out of gear. As regards his actual base, most back-of-the-court players work from just in front of the long service line, but a few like to establish themselves as much as a couple of feet in advance of it. End of Chapter 13. Chapter 14 of The Art of Badminton by Sir George Thomas, Baronet. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. Singles. In many respects, quite apart from any question of greater physical effort, the single game has special characteristics of its own, and these naturally influence the tactics employed. To begin with, the service is delivered under conditions differing from those which operate in doubles, the extra depth of court available greatly lessening the danger attaching to a high service. As a result, It is, I think, a generally accepted maxim among strong players that the lob service should be used much more frequently in a single than any other, though some carry this principle a great deal further than their fellows, even to the extent of keeping to the lob almost exclusively. I fancy I use a short service rather more often than most players in this branch of the game. Of course, much depends on where your opponent stands. If he keeps fairly well back, you can exploit a short service practically with impunity. If he stands more forward, so as to threaten a short service, you can lob with less danger. Against an opponent who stands in about the normal position, 4 feet or so behind the short service line, you will usually find a low service, however accurate, decidedly risky. Your opponent may seldom be in time to rush it effectively, but, if ordinarily quick on his feet, he will be in time to take it very near the top of the net, and in that position, with the whole of the court to play into, he will be at least favorably placed. A lob service also has its danger, obviously. However perfect the length, it may be killed outright. On the other hand, assuming the length to be good, your opponent can only hope to kill it by going all out for his stroke, hitting very hard, and aiming very close to the line, and such an effort, right from the back of the court, is itself dangerous. Failure to score may give an opening for counterattack before the striker has recovered position, to say nothing of the possibility that, in trying to bring off a very difficult winner, he may cut things too fine and hit into the net or out of court. The various chances may really be summed up thus. If you serve a lob, you run the greater risk of being beaten outright by the return, but if not beaten by it, you are likely to be more favorably placed for continuing the rally than you would be if you had opened with a low service. The server starts at a disadvantage anyhow, and must therefore face risk of some sort, and in the long run, it seems to pay better to accept that attending a high service. Another important consideration is this. A good length lob is the most tiring service to return, even though the striker may not attempt to kill outright, and though the difference is trifling at any particular moment, the accumulative effect counts for quite a lot towards the end of a hard match. It goes without saying that accurate length is the essential quality in a lob service, though it is surprising how often even good players fail to use the full depth of the court. Opinions are rather divided as to the advisability of hitting a lob service very high, so that it may be dropping almost perpendicularly before it can be taken. A shuttlecock falling in this way is rather more difficult to kill than one following a more curved path. On the other hand, a very high service gives the opponent plenty of time to take up the exact position that suits him best, and this may more than neutralize any advantage otherwise gained, especially in the case of a player whose overhead work is appreciably stronger on one flank than on the other. As with other details, you must be prepared to adapt your methods to the needs of the moment. The drive service should be used much more sparingly in singles than in doubles. Very occasionally, and coming quite unexpectedly, it is a useful change, but it is always highly dangerous. Once the rally is fairly underway, you will find that you often have a wider choice of available strokes in a single than in a double, which is only natural, seeing that you have only one opponent to avoid instead of two. There is, however, another side to the picture, the risk attaching to certain strokes being greatly enhanced, for you have to cover the whole angle of return yourself, instead of being able to leave to your partner the defense of some vulnerable corner. This applies particularly to attacking strokes hit with all your power or played on the run. Take, for example, a cross-court smash from the back of the court. Used with discretion, this is one of the most effective attacking strokes in the game, and scores outright much more frequently, I should say, than a smash straight down the line. At any rate, that is so, I am sure, against the average player who, for some reason or other, seems to find a straight smash much easier to deal with. But unless you score outright, the return to your cross-court smash, assuming that you have hit it with full power, may be extremely unpleasant. Your opponent's most natural reply will be a fairly straight return, just over the net, into the part of the court furthest from you. This will be comparatively easy for him and may come back much too quickly for your liking. The corresponding position, when you smash straight down the line instead of across, is not so dangerous, or at least the return most likely to trouble you is not so easy for your opponent. For in this case, an attempt to keep the shuttlecock as far away from you as possible necessitates turning it across the court, which, in reply to a really fast smash, is far more difficult than a straight return. Moreover, the cross-court return, having further to go, takes a little longer and gives you just a shade more time in which to get up to it. In writing this, my object is not to discourage you from smashing across court, but to indicate the risk you may incur by so doing. In spite of its dangers, this smash probably produces more winners than any other stroke, and I advise you to go for it wholeheartedly if you feel you have a real opening. But when you play it merely as an incident in your attack, without much prospect of actually scoring outright, it will often pay you to sacrifice some degree of pace, if that enables you to take up a more favorable position before your opponent plays his return. Remember, too, that the effectiveness of a cross-court smash does not depend entirely on pace. To bring it down as short as possible is often the main consideration. There is an important difference in this respect between the straight and the cross smash. In the case of a straight smash, the maximum of pace is almost always the chief desideratum, while depth is often, though by no means always, an actual advantage. The cross-court smash, however, should hardly ever be really deep, because the deeper it is, the closer will it pass to the center of the court, and the easier will it be, therefore, for the opponent to intercept it. Another stroke which, though of immense value as an occasional weapon, should be used with the utmost discretion is the full-power drive. Play it at the wrong moment, when your opponent can intercept it early, and his return will be back over the net almost before you have completed your follow-through. But at the right moment it is the best stroke in the game, though perhaps not far from the most difficult, and I think most players might exploit it more than they do, with good results. The straight drive down either line, certainly. The cross-court drive is obviously the more risky, and should be used very sparingly indeed. I am writing of the really fast drive, hit practically as hard as possible. A medium-paced drive, in any direction, is a very useful stroke, occasionally attacking, but mostly non-committal, and most strong players employ it to good purpose. The rush is another stroke that comes into the category marked dangerous. If indecisive, it is as likely as not to lose the ace straight away, the return sometimes a low lob, sometimes a quick push at an awkward angle, frequently coming back before the player who has rushed in can recover himself. But don't, on this reason, be afraid to rush when you have a suitable opening. It is the same question that you meet at almost every point of the game, that of gauging the chances, and only experience can teach you when the risk is worthwhile. Get to know your opponent's game as quickly as you can, not so much his normal game, as his game at the particular time you are playing him. Even if you know him well, there is generally some useful information to be gathered, for the form of practically every player, even the very best, varies in small details from day to day. For instance, your opponent may, on general form, be exceptionally good at close work near the net, and it will be your usual policy to give him as little opportunity for it as possible. But on some special occasion he may be just failing at the shots he commonly plays so well, though the rest of his game may be up to or even above his usual standard. If, through fear of his usual skill in this direction, you neglect to test him, you may never realize his temporary weakness, whereas, if you do tumble to it, you may be able to exploit it with great success. Therefore, test your opponent thoroughly in all directions at the beginning of a match, and if you find him breaking down in some particular, give him plenty of chances to do so. But don't overdo it. It is often more paying to nurse the temporary weakness of your opponents, playing on it lightly, so to speak, with the idea of conserving it, than to harp on it persistently. Attack it too frequently, and your opponent will very likely discover what he is doing wrong and correct it. Whereas, if you refrain from trading on it too constantly, he may not realize exactly what is wrong and may remain vulnerable in this particular respect to the end of the match. Habitual weaknesses are different. These are not likely to be strengthened in the course of a match, however severely attacked, and you can afford to play on them all the time. If there be any habitual weakness in your opponent's game, it does not follow that you will make the most of it by attacking it straight away. Take, for example, that very common failing, defective defense of the backhand corner of the baseline. If you start every rally with that point as your objective and make it your only target, I am stating an extreme case as an illustration, your opponent will naturally take up a base somewhere in that direction and, to a great extent, cover his weakness. What you want to do is to open it up by drawing him as far away as possible and then attack his vulnerable flank. Not always, of course. Sheer, steady pressure on the weak spot may sometimes lead to an opening, but in the main, the principle of drawing the guard away before trying to break through is sound. In adapting your tactics to the special features of your opponent's play, you must consider his strong points as well as his weaknesses. The obvious ideal is to avoid them, but that cannot be fully attained. However cleverly you may place, you must now and again give him an opening for some favorite stroke. Therefore, you must be prepared with some effective counter for use when necessary. To my thinking, much the best way of dealing with your opponent's best stroke is to make its use as dangerous for him as possible. Devise a method of attacking it, even at some risk to yourself. As an example of what I mean, let us credit him with a particularly severe smash. Now, in an average situation, the easiest way to return a smash is to take it late, when it has nearly reached the floor. But though your return, played thus, may be perfectly sound, it is mainly defensive and unlikely to cause your opponent any particular trouble, allowing him, as it does, the maximum time for recovering position. But suppose you move forward so as to meet the smash as early as possible. It is a dangerous maneuver, admittedly, and may result in your being beaten by a shot which you could otherwise have returned. But if you do succeed in intercepting the shuttlecock soon after it has crossed the net, you are at once on the attack instead of on the defensive, and a well-placed short return will give your opponent all the trouble he wants with, not infrequently, a bit over. The successful working of such a maneuver naturally demands very quick realization of the exact path along which the shuttlecock is traveling, and you can only hope to bring it off when the smash has been played from somewhere pretty far back. Against a smash from close in, you must be content to concentrate on defense, but then you should never, if only one could act up to this ideal, give the chance of a short kill. Given a reasonable prospect of success, however, I believe the attempt to attack your opponent's smash offers good value for the risk involved. Apart from anything else, the moral effect may be worth a lot. Only a very imperturbable player can remain really unmoved when his pet attacking stroke is turned to his own disadvantage, and if you succeed in undermining his confidence, causing him either to tone down the pace of his smash or to be more chary in his use of it, you will have taken a big stride towards victory. Another possible effect on your opponent, even more useful, may be to lure him into trying to oversmash, usually a very expensive error. Turning from your opponent's peculiarities to your own, these must also be kept well in your mind's eye. One of the faults you have to guard against is that of employing your favorite strokes too frequently, a tactical error none the less real because it is so natural. The too constant use of any stroke, however perfect of its kind, robs it of much of its effect. Not only because familiarity may breed contempt, but also because the more reason your opponent has for expecting a particular shot, the easier it is for him to deal with it should it come. The way you are likely to get the most value out of a particularly effective stroke is by keeping your adversary in a constant state of suspense as to whether it be coming or not. Use it liberally, of course, but substitute something quite different sufficiently often to keep him on tenterhooks as to your intentions. The effect of a really fine smash, for instance, is greatly enhanced if your opponent cannot be sure, until the last moment, that he may not be called upon to deal with a drop or a good length lob instead. This is merely one particular aspect of the value of variety, an essential weapon in all phases of the game. but I want to lay particular stress on it here because it is so easy to get in the habit of trusting too much to some favorite stroke. As for your weaknesses, the only sound counsel is that of perfection. Eradicate them. That is, of course, a task to be taken in hand when practicing, and will be best accomplished by giving your opponent every opportunity to plague you with the strokes you particularly dislike. In match play, however, you can do a good deal to protect a weak flank, say by adjusting your position in court so as to cover it as far as possible. But that is, at best, only a makeshift, and a clever opponent will find some way of reaching your vulnerable spot whatever you do. Moreover, in seeking to give extra protection to some particular spot, you may easily leave an opening elsewhere. One frequently sees an inexperienced player edging so much to his left in the desire to guard that flank that he leaves his forehand line entirely exposed. Any weakness will, in fact, always find you out in some way or another, and the only cure is to tackle it firmly and overcome it. But leaving any radical weakness out of the question, there will probably be certain strokes that you do not fancy, though you may be able to play them well enough when compelled to do so. By noting what other strokes are apt to lead up to the objects of your aversion, you will discover how to avoid them as far as possible. But never let such an idea become an obsession, or, in trying to avoid some little inconvenience, you may land yourself in real trouble. I know that I handicapped myself for years by pandering to an inveterate distaste for lobbing, and it made a great difference to my game when I forced myself to make proper use of that very potent weapon. One of the most important things in a single is to make the best use of the fraction of time elapsing between one's own stroke and the next return, by getting into the best position for meeting that return, whatever it may be. This is, of course, an exercise in anticipation, and two objects must be kept in view: to be in position to take advantage of the most likely opening, should your opponent make a weak stroke, and to be able to counter adequately any attacking move he may make. This is one of the few phases of the game in which I value defensive above offensive considerations. I have already dealt with it, to some extent, in the chapter on general tactics, but it has rather a special application to singles. Against a really clever opponent, I am seldom inclined to gamble on his presenting me with any particular opening, even though he be in serious trouble. However tacked up he may be, he has also always a choice of at least two widely different strokes. In extreme cases, he may, of course, have virtually no choice, and then you can concentrate on the chance which will probably come your way. But normally, I prefer to expect the best stroke my opponent has any reasonable chance of making, that is, the stroke which is most likely to cause me trouble. If I have guessed right, his shot will probably worry me less than if I had not anticipated it, while I may still be able to take advantage of an inferior return. If, on the other hand, I gamble on a weak return and he succeeds in playing the best available stroke, I may very likely find myself in the cart. This sort of principle cannot naturally be reduced to a rule of thumb. The point I want to make is that where offensive and defensive considerations clash, anticipation in a single should aim at keeping yourself out of trouble rather than at serving it up for your opponent. Another qualification. When I say that I like to anticipate the best probable return rather than a possible weak one, I do not necessarily mean that I prepare to deal with it defensively. What I really want is to be able to cramp its effect, preferably by counterattack. Just as, against a player particularly severe overhead, I like to crowd in on his smash, meeting it early so as to have a chance of scoring off it, even at some extra risk to myself. So, whatever the stroke I have most to fear at any given moment, I want, if possible, to be in such a position that I can introduce into it at least an element of danger for my opponent, though this ideal is, naturally, not always attainable. All this applies only to that very brief moment after the shuttlecock has left your racket and before it leaves that of your opponent. Anticipation in a single must be restrained by the consideration that you have no partner to save you from the consequences of a bad guess. I know I have said this before, more than once, but it is so important that, risking wearisome reiteration, I repeat once more. that however anxious you may be to reach some particular spot, it is still more essential to have your balance absolutely under control at the precise moment when your opponent plays his stroke, so that you can, if necessary, move in a different direction from that along which you have started. If properly on your toes, you can cover a surprising amount of court after the shuttlecock has actually left your opponent's racket and before it reaches the floor. When taking a drop shot, I believe firmly in getting to it as quickly as possible. This may entail a little extra effort, but it is, I am sure, one of the directions in which an attempt to save yourself is usually false economy. If you can reach the shuttlecock while it is still about on a level with the tape, you have a far wider choice of stroke than would be open to you with the shuttlecock lowered down, a difference which may enable you to call the tune for the moment instead of having to dance to your opponents. If, taking the shuttlecock somewhere near the tape, you play a drop shot yourself, you give your opponent the least possible time to get to it, as you have practically only to cause the shuttlecock to fall instead of having to make it rise first in order to clear the net. The difference is only a fraction of a second, but may be enormously important. On the other hand, if your opponent, being some distance from the net, feels compelled to advance for fear of a drop shot, you are ideally situated for substituting a low and comparatively quick shot to the back of the court, which may catch him off his balance. After getting to the shuttlecock as quickly as you can, you may sometimes, with advantage, slightly delay your actual stroke, hoping your opponent to commit himself to some unwise movement of anticipation, but not long enough to limit your choice of stroke. Almost my favorite shot in a single is a medium-paced drive, entirely a wrist stroke, played from within a few inches of the tape just a fraction of a second later than I have endeavored by my action to suggest. When the drop shot you are taking is one of those played from fairly far back, with a low trajectory so that, if allowed to fall, it might travel about as far as the short service line, an attempt to take it close to the tape will often mean that you have to move a good deal further forward than would otherwise be the case. Even then, unless you happen to be seriously tired, I think the extra exertion usually pays. I have in mind one or two very fine players who are content to wait for these shots and take them quite near the ground. Their returns from this position are generally very accurate, but it is a big but, hardly ever so effective, for the purpose of keeping an opponent guessing as those played from closer in. As always, however, there is something to be said on the other side. Singles are such hard work that conservation of energy is always important, sometimes even vital. Never take more out of yourself than is justified by the advantage you may reasonably hope to secure as a result of your effort. That is mere horse sense. But the general idea of taking drop shots as near the tape as you can is, I am convinced, as sound in practice as in theory. As in other branches of the game, I am all for attacking methods, but there is great scope in singles, much more so than in doubles, for attack by means of shots depending for their effect on placing rather than on pace. The smash naturally remains the chief attacking weapon, given suitable occasion for its use. But many a placed shot, which would be purely non-committal in a double, has in a single definite attacking value, and may even be an actual winner. Therefore, without renouncing attempts to score, attack may often be conducted somewhat less vigorously than in a double, and this is, of course, a very useful way of conserving energy, waste of which is apt to entail a very heavy penalty. Continual hard smashing against a strong defense is a most exhausting proceeding, and even when partially successful may easily take so much out of the striker as to overtax his staying power in a stern match. This does not imply, however, that the player who forces the pace is necessarily working harder than his opponent. The opposite is frequently the case. For one of the chief aims in well-regulated attack is to keep the defender perpetually on the move, and the energy expended in covering the court against a series of well-directed attacking strokes must be weighed against any special effort entailed by their performance. Still, you should always be quick to realize if your plan of attack is taking more out of you than its results warrant, and, if necessary, tone it down. Subject to that consideration, however, smash hard and often, and go all out for a kill if you think the opening good enough. Also, never be afraid of aiming very close to a sideline, especially when smashing straight down a line. It often happens that there is a narrow but quite definite opening if you can place the shuttlecock really accurately. But the margin for keeping it out of your opponent's reach may be no more than an inch or two. Don't hesitate if you think there is such an opening to aim into that very narrow space. If you have real control of the shuttlecock, you should be successful much more often than not. Of course, if you have a wider opening and can probably score without cutting things so fine, it would be foolish to take an unnecessary risk. But against a good defensive player, definite scoring chances are very hard to find, and whenever you see one, however slight it may be, you should go for it boldly. As an alternative to smashing at a line, smashing straight at your opponent is sometimes very effective, especially if he has put up a weakish lob from somewhere near the net, and you are in time to hit while he is still trying to regain a better defensive position. Other shots, as well as a smash, gain value if placed very near a sideline, for the opponent is often in doubt as to how to act, and through hesitancy may quite possibly finish by making a poor return. Singles in tournament play are so strenuous that not everyone cares to indulge in them, but I strongly advise every ambitious player to practice them as far as opportunity permits, even though he may confine himself to doubles in match play. One single will do more than several doubles to show up weaknesses and to emphasize the necessity of curing them. You cannot shirk using your poorer strokes in a single. You can, to some extent, in a double, and they will let you down, time after time, until you improve them. Anyone who practices singles seriously must develop sound strokes of every description and a good all-round game, and they are, therefore, the best form of practice. End of Chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Art of Badminton by Sir George Thomas, Baronet. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. Match Winning. The disappointing player who just fails to produce his best form when it is really needed is a familiar figure in badminton, as in other games. Though perhaps capable of an almost faultless display when things are going well, he seems always to break down under a real test, and to lose with monotonous regularity to opponents no more, frequently rather less skillful than himself, but possessed of superior match-winning ability. This particular faculty is something quite distinct from the technique, either of strokes or of tactics, of the game, and has nothing to do with the caliber of the player concerned. A fourth-rate performer may be a fine match winner in his own class. Temperament has, of course, an important effect on results, but there is a tendency to ascribe too many failures to its influence. For the player who is not blessed by nature in this respect can always achieve some improvement, at least by determined effort. He may not be able entirely to eradicate his weaknesses, but he can master them in part. Many a player apparently resigns himself to the fact that he is overexcitable, or too easily depressed, or whatever his particular trouble may be, and leaves it at that, whereas by tackling it firmly he could do much to counteract the defect. Anyhow, special match-winning ability is far from being solely a matter of temperament. Other factors play their part. And the following are a few practical points, some connected with temperament, others not, attention to which may make all the difference to the result of a match. If you throw away an ace by some silly error, don't worry about it. Some players let a blunder get on their nerves to such an extent that it affects their play in the next 3 or 4 rallies, with the result that one bad stroke actually leads to the loss of several points. And the more critical the state of the score, the more likely is such a player to be put off his game by a wasted chance or other mishap. Therefore, forget a bad stroke as soon as you have played it, unless you can deduce from it some information likely to save you from repeating the mistake. As a matter of fact, it is often possible to gain most valuable information through one's own errors. To illustrate what I mean, suppose you serve a lob, which your opponent leaves, and it falls over the sideline. Be careful to notice, in such a case, not only how far over the sideline the shuttlecock falls, but also how far it goes towards the back of the court. You can thus obtain very useful evidence as to the length you are keeping with your lobs. It is very hard to judge this at all accurately so long as your opponent returns them, and, if necessary, you can send them deeper. Never relax just because you happen to hold a good lead. Badminton is a game in which, between fairly level opponents, the tables may be turned extraordinarily quickly. When things begin to go wrong, a sequence of several aces can be lost in next to no time, and however far ahead you may be, you are never really safe against an opponent of your own class until you have scored the final ace. And if you do relax, you will find it very hard indeed to get going again when you want to. Many an important match has been chucked away because the player who had victory practically in his grasp neglected to concentrate properly on the task of driving his advantage home. I could narrate woeful experiences of my own. On the other hand, while avoiding the error of holding the opposition too cheaply, do not go to the other extreme. Confidence, when not allowed to run riot, is a great aid to success, and the more confident you play your strokes, the more accurate they are likely to be. I know that confidence cannot be produced to order, but if you have acquired real command of the shuttlecock, you should at least have no qualms as to the execution of any ordinary stroke. Even when up against someone appreciably better, on paper, than yourself, remember how frequently paper form is upset, and make up your mind to provide a surprise. Do not allow yourself to be overawed by a reputation. Advice of this sort is admittedly easier to give than to follow. Some players are constitutionally nervous, and never really master that failing. But even if you suffer under that affliction, you can often minimize its consequences by concealing your state of mind. If you let your opponent see that you are nervous, he will not only be encouraged, but will also adapt his tactics to your condition. Even more important is it sometimes to hide your nervousness from your partner, especially from a partner subject to the same weakness, for nothing is more infectious. So, even though you feel that your blood has turned to water, simulate complete self-possession. Camouflage in this respect is not really difficult, and becomes almost automatic after a time, whereas visible signs of nervousness, if unchecked, are apt to grow more and more pronounced. I fancy I am generally regarded as rather a phlegmatic player, but if so, the reputation is entirely undeserved. As a matter of fact, I am often subject to acute attacks of nervousness in important games, though I cloak them as well as I can with an affectation of assurance. Acting on the principle, a basic idea in all games, of doing unto others as you don't want them to do unto you, be alert to discern any sign of nervousness in your opponent. When you do observe anything of the sort, attack for all you are worth. Force the pace of the rallies and hassle your opponent to the best of your ability, not between the rallies, of course, but in every legitimate way. To a player suffering from nerves, serving is by far the most trying ordeal in the game. He has so much more time than in the case of other strokes to think of the mistakes he may make, and once confidence in service has been shaken, it is very hard indeed to get it back. Therefore, it is often useful to make a special effort at the beginning of a match to knock your opponent off his service, even at the expense of running considerable risk in your attempts to rush it. This applies to doubles more than to singles. Concentrate your whole attention on the game itself, remaining oblivious if you can to anything happening outside the court. This is not always easy. Spectators are often guilty of little acts of thoughtlessness, likely to distract the players, such as moving about near the court during the progress of a rally, or laughing or talking unnecessarily loudly. These and other minor annoyances may force themselves on your notice to some extent, but they will affect you very little unless you start to think about them. Let them get on your mind, however, and they will worry you to a degree out of all proportion to their real triviality. Cultivate an equally detached attitude towards those little strokes of luck, wrong decisions, strokes off the wood, and so on, that are inseparable from the game. It is, of course, unnecessary to emphasize the importance of accepting a bad decision against oneself without showing surprise, much less dissent. But many a player whose attitude towards the umpire on such occasions is all it should be, allows himself to be thoroughly rattled by the incident all the same. Don't let yourself fall into this habit, for it is only a habit. Remember that luck, good or bad, is all part of the game, and that if you seem to be having, at some time, an undue share of ill fortune, you will in all probability have a run of good luck later on to balance matters. Anyway, worrying over the misfortunes of the moment only accentuates them, and if you take them philosophically, you will both play better and enjoy the games more. In a hard match, keep something up your sleeve, if you can, for use in a crisis. Some particular return of service, for example, or a variation in tactics. It need not always be an improvement on what you have been doing up to that stage, though if you can afford to keep some favorite stroke in reserve for the purpose, so much the better. The point is that it should be as different as possible, something your opponent has not previously encountered in that particular match. Even though not especially formidable in itself, a totally unexpected stroke coming at such a time may quite possibly throw your opponent momentarily off his balance. This is, in my opinion, a very important detail of method, and it has served me well in many a close finish. Needless to say, any stroke that you keep in reserve for a crisis must be one in the execution of which you are not likely to make any mistake. Otherwise, its sudden production may be more dangerous to you than to your opponent. End of Chapter 15. End of The Art of Badminton by Sir George Thomas, Baronet.